And we're live.
Hey, welcome to my kitchen, everybody. Welcome back. This is the final day of the making of the Lunar Eclipse Kyphi. We didn't live stream every step of the way with this particular one because I don't know if you noticed, but we did a 3 day virtual convention, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of this past weekend. And there was a lot of moving parts that went into leading up to that. So, in between doing my daily adding of an ingredient, from the lunar eclipse onward, we were also running classes and organizing panels, and I led a pretty in-depth class on metasurgery, which is sort of the capstone of my particular energy work tradition for healing. And we are at the day where we need to boil down this particular and very special batch of Kefi. And we have 2 more ingredients to go and probably a whole lot of heat. So without further ado, this is the Kefi mash as it exists right now. And for those of you who have been keeping score, this is a cup of golden raisins and a cup of Turkish figs. And there is honey mead in place of the sweet red wine as the moistening agent. This also has, let me grab my recipe. This also has galangal root, pine nuts, juniper berries, elderberries, henna, honeybush, catnip, which, trust me, was interesting to add given that I have 3 very exuberant pussycats who all wanted to partake. White cedar, uh, Vietnamese agarwood, which is an incredibly rare and pricey aromatic wood. Cinnamon, cassia cinnamon, so the cinnamon that we're used to being in on our cinnamon toast and our cinnamon buns, not quite the true cinnamon, which is a different variety of like the sweet red hot type of cinnamon. So this has a warmer, spicy, woodsier scent as a result. And then we've got benzoin and orris root instead of sweet flag. Why orris root instead of sweet flag? They are both fixatives for scents. They're both similar varieties of things. Orris root has connections to uh, a couple of the like herbal associations we want to bring in with this particular Kefi, because this one is for protection and not exclusively for opening the gates to the other realm. Now, as Kefi, it will still have some of that effect, but the real purpose is protection during the dark hours of night. So as we descend into our dark hour work, as we descend into the realm of death and spirits, as we go through the process of rebirth before we're finally reborn, before we have an awakening, this is the scent that will call in the powers to keep us safe on that journey. And it seemed like a pretty good time to start working on that. It has some associations with the god Set, which has also influenced some of my choices for the things that are in this. Orris root has some connections to testicles. Um,
I didn't know that, and I've been listening to every one of these videos.
At least that was one of the associations that I was taught very early on as a little baby. Like, I don't want to say baby witch because I was never really a baby witch, but as I was starting to like learn and practice all this stuff, that was one of the things. And Set has some weird, interesting connections to testicles, the loss thereof, and the regaining thereof, and a whole bunch of complicated things, which we won't get into too much. And today we will have gugulu, also known as Google gum. It is related to myrrh, but it's often known as sweet myrrh or bdellium. It's used widely in Ayurvedic medicine. It has a whole lot of properties for uh, your health and protecting you, and it is much gummier than myrrh, and has this where myrrh has kind of a bitter, sharp medicinal scent. Google gum is sweeter overall. So like the final scent that we're going for with this is warm, spicy, sweet. Uh, I hesitate to say masculine, but compared to our standard Kefi, it's going to have a warmer, muskier smell. And then the final thing that goes in with the Google gum and the honey, uh, after a little bit of labdanum, which is another fixative and also another very potent, lovely scent, is dragon's blood, which has a lot of associations with protection, and just looks really cool anyway, because, I mean, it's this resin that comes down to, has this rich red color, and really lives up to its name, but has a sweet, vaguely salty smell. So that will be our capstone ingredient. And without further ado, we're going to start heating this up very slowly. This is a long process, so if you want to, am I?
It's just the top of your head that's cut off.
Okay. I mean,
we need that.
Yeah, we need that.
All right.
I mean,
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You are fully visible.
All right. The one thing that's going to be a little weird with it is this particular mix of dried fruit sucked up the fluid. Like, I've already used all of the wine that I would be allowed to use for this, but it is a batter.
Yeah,
like,
let me bring this over. This is really different from the other one.
Yeah, it's really, really different.
Interesting.
So it's a thick batter already, and we'll end up slowly warming it. I've got it on a lower heat than I normally would. And of course, it's in this big copper kettle, so that it will evenly distribute the heat. This is used for risotto and a couple of like heavy sugar candy making things. You don't cook most food in copper because of the chemical reaction that it has going, but with low heat, low acidity foods, it has an interesting effect on things that are made with egg whites, and it helps the egg whites get really, really fluffy, and helps cook things that are sugary. And there's a couple of Italian sugary sweets that these sorts of copper things are made for, some French ones too. So, in keeping with trying to make this as authentic as possible, of course, all unlined copper vessels. These are olive wood, and nothing plastic has touched this to the best of my ability. Can't vouch for like when it was getting, any of the ingredients were being processed from where they came from. But if you saw me unboxing stuff that came from like Wild Tree Essentials, they don't pack their incense resins in plastic. They pack them in little undyed cotton bags. So, I want to kind of see this warm up a bit first to get an idea of like how much I'm going to have to stir on it. Okay, yeah, it's already getting weird. Smoky.
So usually when you boil down the Kyphi, it's much less dry than this.
Yes.
Is there anything that you're thinking about doing to make that consistency?
I have considered adding a little bit more of the, if it looks like it's going to be a problem, I have a little bit of the honey mead still left. I mean, I'm hesitant to add too much because, quite honestly, the work, like most of the work today, is trying to just boil the fluid out. I kind of don't want to put more fluid in and make it a longer boil.
Yeah.
Which pretty much just means that I'm going to have to be vigilant with this. Stir it a lot. Yeah, I'm going to keep it on a 2, like real low, as I have a lot of work to do with honey aspect. So we need 2 cups of honey, which was sacred for the ancient Egyptians, used widely in their medicine, and is the only food that never spoils. When they opened up the tomb of King Tut, Tutankhamun, there was a vessel of honey, and it was thousands of years old, and it was still good.
Can you talk a little bit about what happens if you put this on a charcoal briquette to burn it?
Okay, so this type of incense and the base with which we're working with, which is fruit, honey, and wine, does not burn well. It's not meant to be burnt to like an ashy cinder. Instead, think of it as the ancient version of a wax melt. So it's supposed to be burnt or heated at a fairly low temperature. You don't want to put it directly on a charcoal because with all of the sugar and plant matter, specifically the dried fruit, it will carbonize very quickly and smell quickly, very unpleasant. So you want something that is warm, but not too hot. And trying to rig something so that it is a little bit over the charcoal. A couple of folks have suggested letting the charcoal burn down so that it is not as hot, not like just, seethingly red hot, that there's a lot of ash around it, cushioning it. I have also found if you have one of those burners where you are burning it like over a little tea light, burning it over a tea light will work because it will release the temperature. I have a fancy little Bakur burner which has a dial on it that allows me to control the temperature. And I have found, at least with the previous batches of Kyphi, that the ideal temperature for the longest release of the scent is about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really, really low when you think about putting most of your other resins directly on a charcoal. Now, the interesting thing is once you start playing around with heavy resin and wood incense on that low of a temperature, you find that you've been wasting your expensive shit all this time because you can get all of the scent out. It's a little slower to release at first. It's not like an immediate release, and there's much less smoke. So if you happen to be in a place where you can't have smoke and you can't have incense ordinarily because of the smoke, burning this type of incense or burning your other incense without actually burning it allows you to have all of the scent and none of the trouble. The other handy thing with this style of incense is it lasts a very, very long time. Like a little bit, you get a lot out of it. So the tiny little balls of Kyphi that I have, we were using over the weekend while we were running stuff for the Housekeeper Gather. And there'd be a point after, I don't know, 2 hours, 3 hours of it being on, where I'd start to smell and it seemed a little bit, just a little bit of a charred scent after being on for that long at 180 degrees. And I'd turn it off and I'd let it cool back down. And when it got hard and cold again, I just flipped it over and turned it back on, and I had Kyphi for another several hours. So that's pretty handy because this stuff is not cheap. The stuff that goes into it is definitely not cheap. This particular one, I knew I wanted to have dragon's blood in it, and I bought dragon's blood a while ago because I thought it would be interesting. It does not, dragon's blood does not appear as an ingredient in the traditional recipe as it appears on the walls of the Temple of Edfu. However, there are a number of modern blends that will include dragon's blood. But I have since discovered that dragon's blood is now ridiculously hard to get a hold of and very expensive. So I'm happy that I have the chunk that I did because I'm going to need about 3/4 of a cup of it. And yeah, for some reason, probably because of, well, because of the state of the world, a lot of stuff is harder to get a hold of right now. All right, for ease of time and stuff, I'm going to just leave the rest of this and open another one. And we can pull the honey out of this for our own purposes.
Delicious tea.
This is from the Schmidt family farms down in Medina on State Road. And I bought it because I went to school with John Schmidt. Can't say that I particularly got along with him, but I did get along with a lot of people when I was in school.
You really have mellowed.
To be fair, I didn't get along with them because a lot of them picked on me.
Also,
yeah.
Fair.
Which is to say also, having met some of them again years later, they also have mellowed. So, we some of us get older and wiser.
So we've got a question.
Yeah.
And let this serve as an invitation. If you have questions for Michelle.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we live stream these Kyphi boils is they take a really long time.
Hours and hours.
They're not as interesting if we don't have people to talk to. So our first question was from Storm. Have you ever been in a trance? And if so, what were your experiences?
It depends on what you mean by trance. I do not do willingly full-on lose consciousness trance work. That's not to say that it didn't happen accidentally a couple of times when I was younger, and that's how I learned that I'm not very keen on that. Like I'll be straight up. I'm kind of a control freak. I like to be in control of my faculties, and one of the things that is most important to me is memory. And with full-on trance states, you don't always have the luxury of remembering what just happened. So now there are a number of different altered states that I have been trained and have played around with working with, several of which I use for past life recall. So the most common use I have is what I think of as a light trance state, where I'm in an altered state and I am kind of, the consciousness is closest to like a waking dream, where there's a part of me, enough of me that is still here to speak and record and sort of observe in that therapy sense of like your detached observer. But the rest of me is just immersed in the experience and allowing whatever to intuitively flow. I have once done trance possessory work where I allowed a spirit to speak through me and use my body. And let me tell you that that is also well beyond my ordinarily area of comfort, but it was for someone who I knew very well while he was alive. He had died unexpectedly and tragically at 50. His name was Michael Wiggins. He's very, very well known and very well loved in the Michigan pagan community. The founder and force behind a lot of different events up there, not the least of which is Convocation, which is a hotel-based pagan event, pan-spiritual event really, that happens in the Dearborn area every year in February. And it's been going on since I think 1996. Well, they at Convocation trade off with who is the con chair every year. And that person is responsible for doing the magical work and for carrying the theme of the convention and all of the transformational work that the convention is aimed at doing for people throughout the whole year. And it culminates in the opening ritual as they set the stage, so to speak, for that weekend. And Michael died before he could complete his duties as the con chair. So his wife, who is a very dear friend of mine, specifically approached me and asked if I would be willing to stand in for him, and if there was any way in which it would be possible for me at least to involve him in spirit in that process. And in discussion with her and in discussion with him, we made an arrangement where I would enter the circle, and I would let him take as much charge of me as he wanted so that he could be there more than just in spirit. And I remember being in the back, like, you know, I was wearing some things of his. We used to like dress like each other and kind of like mock one another in a fun sort of way. So I was dressed up in some of the like Sinatra-esque stuff that I would wear to kind of poke fun at his style. And I was wearing some of his things. And, you know, I'm sitting back there going, this isn't going to work. Everybody's going to be so disappointed. There's thousands of people out there, and it's just going to be me prancing around looking silly. But, you know, I did the work, and I had a little thing that I was just kind of reciting to myself to call him up and call him in and to allow and invite him. And I remember once the doors opened, and once I went into the circle, I remember like kind of extending my hands and saying some stuff, at which point my perspective started to pull back. And it's very much like an out-of-body experience, which I've had enough of to recognize. And there's this sense of watching myself for the rest of it, for the duration of being in the circle anyway. And I know that there was like some song and dance, like there was some little jazz number that the body did, and it's my voice, only it's not my voice, and my physical gestures and my facial expression were very, very different. There were some things that were said to people and about the event, and I don't have a conscious, clear recollection of that. I just know that whatever occurred, I am confident that it was Michael, and that he came through. Most of the witnesses certainly seemed confident to that effect. And this is the funny part, because this is sort of the sort of relationship that we had, he and I and his wife and everybody, is on his, as I left the circle, as my body left the circle, and as we left the circle, Michael departed, because I'd set some very, very clear rules of like how long this could last, because I really didn't cherish the idea of spending the whole convention with somebody skin riding me, no matter how much I liked them. But his parting comment was, "Told you I'd get into your pants." Which I told his wife immediately, and she laughed, because that was, we were very silly with one another, and like would flirt in an egregious sort of fashion, because we both were people in positions where people would frequently expect us to be, I don't know, like horn dogs screwing everybody all the time, and we just, it wasn't really always all about that. So anyway, that was my one time of consciously allowing someone to possess me, which raises the issue. Like, a lot of people hear possession and they think only demons, and that's just not the case. I think we don't necessarily think of channeling as possession, as a type of trance-possessory state. Maybe you've heard of what they do in voodoo and candomblé and santeria with the luas and the orishas, riding en cheval, riding a person, but that is a willful trance-possessory state. And depending on the circumstance, the person who is being horsed or ridden, i.e. possessed, may have the same kind of recollection of the experience that I did with Michael's experience, or no recollection at all, or they may negotiate for a little bit more volition and control. And it is a negotiation in that case. So that's that fun stuff. And now I get to try to melt Google gum in honey. Yeah, very low heat.
What type of dragon's blood are you using in this recipe?
Draconea, dragon's blood.
Cool.
Because I know that there's several different types that it comes from.
Was there something that influenced you to choose that type? Or
honestly, it was what was available at the time, gotcha. So it was what I had on hand. It is the one that I've preferred using. And I don't know, it's got like a sweet but not like overpoweringly sweet scent to it. I'm gonna grab a. Okay, so this is labdanum, and it comes in these little pucks. And if you look very carefully, there are little goat hairs in it, because it is from a little island in Greece, and it is traditionally harvested, which is to say that you send the goats out to eat the rock rose, Cistus ladanifer, which is where this stuff comes from, and you comb it off of the goats' beards, because the gum of the plant gets stuck in their little goat fur. And that is how this stuff has been traditionally harvested since the time of the pharaohs, to the point where there are artifacts of these little fancy combs, these little like wide-toothed wooden combs that are meant to harvest this particular stuff out of goat beards. Today I learned.
It sounds so weird.
It really, really is. Oh God, it's sticky too. Yikes.
Oh no.
Like everything.
So question, what do you use Kyphi for?
So the standard Kyphi is based off of an incense recipe, directly drawn from an incense recipe of a temple incense that was used in Egypt as part of the daily, think of it like Vespers. So they would burn in the morning, they'd burn incense in the morning, they'd burn incense at noon, Myrrh and frankincense were morning and noon, and then they would burn Kyphi or Kaphet at night. And it was intended to open the doors of perception and to invite visions and dreams and spirit communication. And so it is both a sacred act, but also something that is used for spirit work. And I use it as both. If you happened to watch Haunted Salem Live with Jack and Katrina back, God, it seems like forever ago, but it was really just last October, I used some of that to good effect when we were trying to talk with the spirits of Salem, and when I recreated an old ritual called a spirit gathering that involved a bowl, water, Jack Osborne, and me helping Jack open his perceptions so that he became the channel and the medium. And this incense played a role in sort of setting the stage and heightening the experience and increasing everybody's awareness. Okay, I'm going to put this down real low.
So here's a really interesting clump of questions from one person.
Okay.
Are you able to do remote viewing? I'm currently trying to solve a family murder mystery where there is most likely nothing forensic, even photos. And how do you feel about remote viewing as a way of investigating such a thing?
I've been asked to do it before. So the interesting thing about remote viewing is it's a term invented by the U.S. government to basically find a way to sanitize concepts like clairvoyance and any kind of like perception over a distance. In the course of training remote viewers, it sort of has its own style, which includes trying to perceive at a distance where you're not astrally projecting exactly, you're not sending a part of yourself, you're more extending your perception. And I know that for some people that's probably just going to be parsing semantics. So anyway, do I do stuff from a distance? Yes. Have I tried to do stuff for a distance for a couple of murder investigations? Yes, I've been asked to do it. I don't like to, for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is there's so much expectation and emotion involved in success and failure in that particular situation that I feel that I personally have trouble being 100% objective. And unless you can be, in my opinion, 100% or as objective as possible, rigorously objective of what you're perceiving and what you think your results are, then I prefer not to do it. When I have done this for law enforcement, I'm very clear to be like, I guarantee no results. I'll take a whack at it and I'll give you what I perceive, but you must then like verify. Like, don't take my fucking word for it. We don't want to live in the minority report. Certainly I don't want to live in the minority report where there's a local medium to Ohio who friends went to see her speak here in Medina once, and she, no joke, just very casually talked about how she's always worked with the police, and the police respect her so completely that they were just walking down the street one day, and she was with her homicide detective friend, and she walked past this man, and this man, she just knew he was a murderer, and she turned to her cop friend and said, that man has killed someone, and told him where to find the body, and the cop, according to her, arrested the man on the spot. Can you imagine that actually working? Like, okay, maybe if he was a black man these days, and even then, okay, but in a fair way, like nobody should do that. Like, personally, I think she was fucking lying.
There is no way.
Yeah, no, like in no sense of actual fair police work should that ever be what happens. And
I mean, it's not what happens when people make allegations of sexual assault. Like,
yeah,
they gather evidence first.
So anyway, that's my personal soapbox on it. Is I think doing psychic work for stuff like that is a little dodgy. Now, if you are family, if you are involved in it, if you really feel compelled to try to come up with some idea of what happened to someone, I mean, there's no harm in trying to find it out, especially if the police have done everything that they could already. If, you know, there is no evidence, if it's just a great big question mark. There's someone who came out to one of the Inspiration House events, and I won't give away her name or too much of the circumstances, but her brother was murdered, and they didn't have a whole lot of leads. But what she did have was her brother appearing to her in spirit, explaining to her where to look, and through very, very rigorous pursuit, and tracking down these hunches, not just going, hey, dear police officers, I think you need to look here, but having like clear stuff to point them out and verifying these impressions, and then having the actual investigative work go off of the my gut instinct will point you in this direction, but my psychic stuff will point you in this direction, but it's also why I kind of ended up with the term psychic bloodhound for the portals to hell stuff, because even in paranormal investigation, I don't think that you should take the psychic at face value as 100% accurate. You should take the impressions that we get as one more piece of information that should be investigated and looked into and verified. So, simple answer from a very long ramble is I think it's a complicated situation, and it has to be handled very delicately. There has to be some rigorous controls, and anything that is perceived psychically or remote viewing wise or anything like that given to you by spirits can only be used as the starting point for more traditional investigation and research. And in the end, if it leads you to hard evidence, then that is fantastic. But it should only be used to lead to a discovery of hard evidence.
Makes sense to me.
The other funny thing is like the medium who was saying that said it. The friend who went there, he went with his girlfriend. He himself was a police officer, and he was offended. I think he had a hard time not just calling bullshit right in the middle of the place, but he was trying to be very polite. And this is a medium who's very well loved. She's actually fairly public, might be well known. She and I have locked heads in the past, or locked horns in the past over some stuff, because we have some very different perceptions of things. I would say that my biggest problem with her ethically is that she's one of those like cast everything into the light, and she goes to places and she's thoroughly convinced that like she's just moving everything on, and she has the personal power to open these portals to the other realm and just kick things onto their own wherever. And I think that's very presumptuous.
It actually reminds me, in the home organizing world, if you did that, you would basically end up going to someone's house and throwing out a bunch of their stuff because you didn't think it fit.
Yes, and I think that's just rude.
To do with what they need.
I think it's just rude. Like,
have conversations, people.
Even presuming you can just willy-nilly cause things to like move onto the other side and cross them over, even if presuming you have the ability to do that, if they're not ready, why would you do that? Why would you force something to transition? I mean, you're basically killing the spirit. You're making it go to like the next stage of its journey when it's not prepared and it's not had the time to like go through the proper process. And emotionally prepare and resolve its issues. I'm much more a fan of, instead of crossing over, basically giving ghosts therapy. And I know that sounds silly, but I'm dead serious. A lot of the things that we think of as traditionally earthbound, they are just emotionally entangled. They have a lot of things that they haven't had a chance to resolve. And it's stuff that weighs heavily on them. And at that point, get them somebody to talk to and just work it out. And if at that point they're ready to move on their own, by their own volition, it also presumes that if a spirit is here, that it has no right to be here. And that sort of precludes, like, what about great grandma Ethel, who's hanging around to like watch her most recent great grandchild grow up and is serving the role of guardian and guide? If you just walk into the house and you're like, oh, there's a ghost here, it needs to go, let's move it on, and you kick poor great grandma Ethel's butt just because she wants to watch her latest descendant grow up, that's pretty fucking rude.
Okay, so we've got a couple of fun questions. One that I wanted to throw at you is I've been following you for a couple of years and absolutely find everything that you speak about and teach about really interesting. What do I need to do in order to become a part of House Kepru? And I wanted to both ask that question, but also say, it sounds like if what you're interested in is learning from Michelle, I think one of the best ways to do that is actually to join the Patreon, because there's so many classes that we teach that are only for patrons. There are videos that are only available on there.
So the simple thing, like, what is House Kepru? House Kepru is the magical society I founded back in 1996. It was not formally named House Kepru until the like 98. And we've been active and running the gather since October of 2000. So been around for a little while. Now the thing is we are a teaching society. So what we are focused on is energy work, psychic development, some past life work within our group as well, which has a lot more to do with some entanglement that many of the members share. But my goal with House Kepru has always been to train people to become teachers, to become people who can share these things, which assumes that all of House Kepru is teaching whether or not you join or want to join. Because I'm not really big on making people like join things. I'm not big on, like, the more people we have, the better it is. I'm not big on, well, honestly, I'm not big on joining in the first place. Anybody who knew me growing up or knew me in my early 20s would find the fact that I run an organization and that it has any kind of rules beyond sheer anarchy very astounding, because I'm not really big on structure. I find that it can be very suffocating. So anyway, the simple thing is if you want to learn from us, you don't have to join. There's a lot that we teach and a lot that I personally teach. And for those who join the house as members, that path is, do you want to become someone who's not only dedicated to learning, but also dedicated to becoming essentially priests of instruction, clergy that teach, the core faculty of a mystery university, I guess. And you don't have to be part of that to learn from me. But if you're still interested, we only take a very small number of people per year because we're very, very big on direct person-to-person instruction. So we have maybe 1 or 2 dedicants who take vows every year. Each dedicant is given a sponsor. That sponsor, along with everybody else in the house, kind of mentors them through that journey for the period of at least a year. And we don't add more people until we've had enough pass out of dedicant into first degree. And then the other wrinkle is a good portion of that instruction is in person, which means right now we've got a bunch of people who had put in applications before all of this happened in the world, and they are on hold. So we've got a backlog, and we're not sure.
So how do you go about learning from you or house members right now?
Right now, we are, well, I offer a fair number of classes. I'm getting folks like Kat Mason, Rogers, and other folks in the house to teach classes and make things much more accessible online. We used to do everything in person, and obviously now that is something that needs to change. It is tricky to learn how to change and adapt to this, but on the other hand, it means that stuff that previously wouldn't have been accessible to you if you didn't come out and travel to Ohio, you will have access to in ways that were never really available before this year.
I'm actually trying to get you to say websites.
Oh, website. I
So
have
that
a
people
Patreon.
So people can find where you offer teaching and where the house offers teaching.
I have a Patreon, and that's
There we
probably the
go.
easiest place to find where the classes are to start
Yes.
off with. And I'm funneling various members of the house who I've trained long enough that I am satisfied with their ability to teach.
Yeah, we now have 4 house members on there who are available to take questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically my Patreon is slowly turning into a magical university, which is a wonderful thing.
And one of the things I like best about it is how many practitioners are on there who have different backgrounds, who aren't house members but have learned a ton of stuff, and everybody's so willing to share it.
I do.
It's
I
amazing.
love the little like family of patrons that we've got. It's not just like toss money at me and like feel good with yourself. It's folks who are putting some money into supporting a community, who all have a great deal to offer themselves. Even the ones who are like, I'm really new and I don't know anything, and they've got so much other stuff to offer and so much insight.
That's awesome. Do you have any suggestions on types of incense to burn for home cleansing other than just sage?
Oh, let's see. Personally, I've always liked frankincense or benzoin. I will say benzoin's always been my absolute favorite. A blend of benzoin and labdanum is really, really nice. It really depends. Different cultures had different herbs that they identified as cleansing herbs. Frankincense and myrrh are things that have spread throughout Europe, mainly coming from the Middle Eastern roots of Abrahamic faiths. Trying to think of some of the stuff that was used, and say, it's always interesting if you have the opportunity to look into, whatever your ancestry is, and poke a little bit into the indigenous beliefs before the Abrahamic faiths came through in your particular corner of the world. Because I know, I'm trying to think if it was heather or broom. There's a number of plants that were sacred in like my own Celtic Gaelic roots. And there is, I'm gonna get the mix wrong. I think it's mint, pennyroyal, and peony root is something that turned up in one of the grimoires I was looking at. And the way they're describing using it is pretty much the same way that that folks currently use smudge sticks and sage. So it doesn't always have to be white sage or Palo Santo. Those belong to some other traditions. And I think you can go one of two routes with it. You can try to see what your ancestors used, and that's an interesting journey and experience. Or you can go with what's going to just feel right for you. What makes the space feel clean? What makes you feel like you have accomplished this work of cleansing the space? Does it smell good? Does it trip your allergies? If you're allergic to it, it's not doing a very good job of improving your space. When in doubt, frankincense and myrrh are great. Benzoin and sandalwood are great. Benzoin by itself, benzoin with labdanum. And lavender has a lot of applications in a number of places as well.
So, do you think that one of your own past lives could possibly be from your family's bloodline? Like, could you have been one of your ancestors?
Yes. Actually, it's been my experience that a lot of us tend to keep it in the family, not to be silly about it. So, many years ago, 1995, there was a fellow, Quay, who I met at a big gaming convention called Origins. And we recognized that each of us had like some weird energy work stuff on the side. So outside of the gaming stuff that we were doing, like we sat down and kind of talked about things and traded ideas and family traditions. And at the time, I was having a hard time wrapping my head around. He's Chinese American, by the way, first generation. I'd heard, in that like, oh God, my I've got a comparative religious studies degree, but it's from a Jesuit Catholic college, and so my Asian religions, some of it was really good, and some of it was really white, and I mean, just very very limited, very like looking at somebody else's tradition through the lens of Christianity and interpreting all of it as Christian, and if it didn't fit, then not teaching it. So, a long story short, Chinese ancestor worship made no sense to me at the time. So I did what I recommend to anybody. If you don't understand somebody's practice, talk to somebody who was born to the practice and find out from them, like, what is this? And listen. Don't judge. Don't project your own stuff on it. And what Kuei explained to me made so much sense and actually fit with the fact that there was also reincarnation in that system, where say grandpa passes on, and you set up an ancestor altar for grandpa, because his spirit is still around and he's still looking after the family he was invested in, and he hangs around for a little while as an ancestor because there is some work on that side that he can do, that is different from the work that he can do when he's wearing a body. Certain freedoms and certain powers open up, but he's still invested in the family. So a couple of generations go by, and now he's sort of, over the whole idea of hanging around outside of a body and not being able to partake in family meals and not being able to like hold and touch and care for the people that are part of his family in the same way that he had during his life. So he picks one of his descendants and waits for the right time and becomes one of his own descendants and comes back into the family line. And it was Kuei's suggestion, and I've since found this in a number of systems, that was fairly common, that there were a lot of like souls woven between the same family. This made a couple of things from my childhood make a lot of sense, because there's a high likelihood that I was my own great-grandmother. And it was one of those like, ha ha, you're this person, that my grandmother would sort of talk about in a kind of complicated way when we were little, or when I was little, and poking at it a little bit more. With all of the caveats of I was front-loaded with this, but I think it's actually also true. But to me, it makes a whole lot of sense. Like, you get invested in those people. Like, of course you're going to want to stick around with them. I definitely see it with spirits. Spirits hang around. Like I said, great-grandma Ethel hangs around and wants to, like, take care of, like, the most recent descendant and do her work as a guardian and a guide. I think some people might call that her becoming a guardian angel, but it doesn't preclude her ability to come back. And there's different stuff we do from different sides.
Do you think that has anything to do with traditions of ancestor worship? Or like basically offering energy to ancestor spirits in some cultures?
Yes, absolutely. Could you grab me a hint or something? Yeah. It's very warm.
Yeah, you are leaning over a hot stove.
Yeah, I'm leaning over a hot stove, and it's a warm day to begin with.
Here's cold hot chocolate, if that's a thing. I'm
Maybe.
not sure if that sounds appealing, but
not at the moment. I just think I need some water.
The lid is off, just so you know. A walking hint commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible for souls to cycle almost constantly through incarnations?
So I've encountered like anecdotal stuff, and I don't know all of the traditions that believe that there's like waiting periods for souls between incarnations. And I've found that it varies widely based on circumstance and individual and the way in which they died and opportunity. So, can you hop right back in real quick? Yes. I've definitely seen that. I've seen instances where someone passes on and they're just really over the idea of being in a body, and so they want to try a different way for a while. I've also seen deaths be traumatic enough, or the course of their life be traumatic enough, that they need a break to get over that, to like work through all of the complications it left them with. I have a number of spirits that hang around my house that I refer to as disembodied. Just friends, but they're not wearing bodies. And that's the case for a lot of them. They had various experiences. Many of them are folks who fought and died in wars, and that just sort of wrecked a part of them that they're still working with, still struggling to reclaim.
So here's potentially a deep dive.
Okay.
Let's see where it goes.
Uh-oh.
Can you clarify what is the difference, or what would cause a traumatically murdered spirit to become something demonic? I see this a lot. I'm not sure if it's Hollywood dramatic flair or if it's something that actually happens often.
Honestly, it's more Hollywood flair. So what causes a traumatically murdered spirit to become demonic? People misunderstanding pain or mistaking pain for negative impulse, if this is the case at all. People who are murdered might be really angry, might have a lot of anger and rage to act out, but actually I will tell you about an experience. I don't know if Raziel is watching. He was in here once before. There was a fellow I worked with who'd come to me years ago at the Chamber in Lakewood in Ohio, so our old goth club. He'd been recommended by a friend, and he believed that he was haunted. And he also was really hesitant to talk to anybody about it because he had experienced, like, every time he tried to talk about this, shit just went sideways, bad stuff happened, like poltergeist stuff happened. Well, being who I am, I was like, bring it. So he told me what had happened. He and a buddy had been between homes, between residences, and they were out in Bedford, Ohio, looking for an abandoned house to break into to sleep for the night. And by abandoned house, I mean, like, this is still sort of suburbia, and it, wasn't. So anyway, there was a house that was on the market there, and it looked like it was empty, and they were going to try to break in and find a place to sleep. And he walked up to the driveway, and he got to the base of the driveway, and he had just the worst feeling. And he's someone who, now we would call him an empath. And what he experienced, he struggled to describe it, but it felt like he was perceiving both sides of a brutal assault and murder. A woman, actually a young, like maybe 12 to 14-year-old girl, and a man. And he was experiencing, and all of the emotions from all sides of this. Her fear and terror, and his, everything that you can imagine went with his. And this weird, just all of it tangled up. That ends up being important. So, working with him, hearing the story, he remembered the address of the place like it was seared in his memory. It still stood empty at the time, so like we couldn't really do a whole lot of research on it. There was no indication that something had happened there, but the key thing was it didn't feel like it was either the murderer or the murdered, but some combination of the moment, something like a tangled mess of all of those emotions that had been so intense that it kind of gained a sentience of its own, an existence of its own. And it manifested as very, very physical poltergeist stuff. And it preyed on him. It wasn't a single person, and it did not seem to be either of the people, either the person who was killed or the murderer, who I presume is still kicking around somewhere. But it was something birthed from the event. Long story short, like I dealt with the haunting and I cleared it out. and detached it from him because it was very much attached to him, like using his energy to kind of perpetuate itself, and just sort of like mindlessly creating just these chaotic experiences around it, meanwhile like interfering and just causing meltdowns with technology and all the stuff that you've come to expect from shit like that, making people around him, when it would flare up, like just fights would break out. There'd be a lot of negative emotion stuff flying around. Well, so I'm like, I don't think that this is the girl. I don't think that this is the guy. I think weirdly this is like some weird spirit AI, but I'm going to treat it like it's a ghost just to cut it off and remove it. And okay, done. Well, flash forward many years, and he's working with me at Sunoco. So we're on second shift together. Yes, I worked at a gas station. And he's over counting the cigarettes as we swap off. I'd helped him get the job. And, it was one of the places where I would always end up reading a newspaper. We're going through the newspaper, and, I'd handed it off to him as he's taking his little break. And there's a point where I just sort of feel like this ripple of emotion of just like startled, like stomach dropping, like, holy fuck. And I look over, and he is white as a sheet, just holding this paper, staring at it. And he can't even quite speak. And so finally, I'm like, what are you looking at? And he's like, the house. So it's an article, far back in the thing, not in one of the sections I typically read, about a house in Bedford where they were making repairs on it, and they opened up a part of it, and there was the skeletonized remains of a 14-year-old girl in the wall. It was the house. I do not know if they ever solved that, but I can tell you that many years before, I firmly believe he face planted right into the middle of all of the terrible stuff that was left as a mark on that house. So, to bring it back to the question, do the dead become demons? No. But can incredibly terrible events leave a psychic stain powerful enough that people can pick up on it and feel like they are attacked by it? Yes. Could it feasibly become so intense, so real, that it takes on a life of its own? In at least one case, that is absolutely my belief. So that's my weird story. Actually, that is in Haunting Experiences, by the way, because that was kind of a benchmark learning experience of like, well, shit's pretty weird. It's not just ghosts, not just dead people.
You don't just see dead people.
Well, I mean, Haunting Experiences, at first, like, the idea was, like, I want to write some fun stories. I miss writing fiction. I'm known for my nonfiction, so can I write nonfiction but make them good stories as well? And in the course of making all of these little short stories of actual experiences, I realized that what the book is about is the path of the reluctant medium.
Gotcha.
Like all of the process of, like, trial and error, learning how this stuff works, kind of resisting it at points, exploring it at others, kind of pantsing it at others, where I'm like, I don't fucking know how this works, but I'm going to try this thing right now. And shit, okay, intuition served me well. We'll do that again.
Can new demons be created? Or are the demons that already exist all there are, or all there ever will be?
Well, it really depends on what you mean by demon, because that's a complicated thing by itself. If you are going purely by the Abrahamic, and by which I mean Jewish, Christian, and Islamic approaches to the idea of demon, demons are pretty much the losing side of a war in heaven. They're the folks that decided to rebel against God. Most of them were angels at one point, and they ended up somewhere else. Although even within those religions, it's not as simple as that, because the Abrahamic faiths got a lot of their ideas of angels and demons and spirits from the folkloric traditions that came before them. And so you've got a lot of Sumerian and Babylonian, even ancient Egyptian stuff woven throughout there. folklore that was alive and well on the Arabian Peninsula and woven into Islam particularly, which is how pretty much all of their weird stuff turns into jinn. Poltergeist, Sasquatch, fairies, all of it's jinn. I mean, I can tell you what I define a demon as at this point. It must be sentient, as in an intelligent spirit. It must be non-human in origin. Probably has never had a human body, didn't start off as a person, didn't just like be a person who turned bad and is acting like an asshole in death. So intelligent, non-human, actively malevolent. Like for some reason it's just a dick. Like it does bad stuff and it really gets off on doing the bad stuff. You know, the unbridled sadists of the spirit world seems to feed off of it. And then the fourth criteria for us to call, for me to call it a demon, and this comes down to sort of why demons end up being something people write about in the first place, is for whatever reason, this intelligent, non-human asshole spirit has a fixation on humans and fucks with them on the regular. Usually with the intent of attaching itself to them, at the very least to feed off of them. Usually their fear and their anger and their frustration and all their negative emotions. And at the most extensive situations to try to like control them in some way, up to and including trying to crawl into their skin. And why? As far as I can tell, to just joyride around in it like a privileged teen who just broke into somebody's car to like run around in it for shits and grins. I mean, there seems to be an element of chaos in them as well as malevolence. But there's a lot of different sorts of spirits that kind of fit under that, and they're not all connected to like the Christian idea of damnation and redemption and fallen angels and all of that, which is why when I wrote the Dictionary of Demons and started compiling all of these names, the criteria that I gave myself for, if the name is in there, it had to be explicitly described as either a demon, a fallen angel, or an evil spirit. And that evil quality, that fallen quality, is a significant part of it. Of course, even fallen, not all the fallen angels are actually fallen, and it depends on which midrash and which scripture you read, and which version of the Bible, and that's complicated too. The best thing I can tell you is we've got a lot of words and not everybody uses them the same way. And that's sort of, you know, just language and human experience to begin with. But demon is one of the ones, the more charged something is with belief, the more important it is to certain theologies in worldviews, the more important I think it is to understand the context in which a person is using that word, and to understand, like, when one person says demon, somebody else, it might mean something completely different. So we need to understand, like, what do you mean by that before we just toss the word around. Okay, so this Google gum is mostly melted, but still chunky.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not quite doing the same thing, and I...
You think it needs to, like, be smashed up at all, or?
Not sure.
I'm
going to turn the heat up just... Yeah, I'm going to turn the heat up just a touch. The trick is, of course, if it starts to boil, then it starts to go over my I should have gotten one size up with the pot, but this thing was $160 as it was, so really.
Wow. A lot for a tiny little pot.
Right? Copper is not cheap, as it turns out.
So, okay, we've got a couple of questions that may lead to triggery places for some people.
Okay.
And we've got a couple of more low-key questions. I wanted to ask you, do you have a preference of, like,
let's go low-key
or...
at first. I'm overheating a little bit and need to, like, be careful with this.
All right, low-key questions. Have you ever experienced bilocation?
Yes. Sometimes intentionally, and the first few times completely unintentionally. And it is a weird, when I was writing the psychic dream walking book, I insisted that I had never astral traveled. And I still will say, and here's another thing where names and words are weird. As I understood it, astral travel was a very specific process where you would lay down and you would actually project like an astral part of yourself, and you go walking around in the astral and doing your astral things. And it seemed the people who were talking about it distinguished it from shamanic journeying and visionary traveling and bilocation or dream walking, which is what I'd been taught. And the thing that I've learned is it's all a complicated mess. So I've had a few instances where people have physically seen me in a place where I was not physically at the time. In most of these cases, I was asleep and dreaming, but in the dream I was projecting to them. I was interacting with them, and I assumed the first couple of times that it was just a dream until someone was like, dude, I saw you here, and we had this conversation. I was like, but I was asleep. Like, not even in the same state. So that's a neat thing. I have more success consciously controlling dream walking without the added bilocation fun. Not to say that somebody who's sensitive can't perceive my presence, because that's fun to experiment with. But like the sense of like physically showing up and being perceived as if I was actually there has only happened a rare few times. Usually as flukes. Or at least I didn't mean to do it.
Do you ever get random... Ooh, you okay?
Yep, I'm fine.
It was good.
I don't burn. I was just like, oh, we're going to move fast. Because it's warm.
Good. Do you ever get random messages from spirits?
Not in like the Whoopi Goldberg ghost sort of way of like, tell Bob that I love him. But that might be because I have a fair number of what I'll kindly call spirit allies, those disembodied I mentioned earlier, who kind of have my back. Like, they watch out, and think of them as my spirit bouncers. like they don't let randos just sort of show up and bother me. Sometimes they weed out people that I might actually want to have a conversation with, but they're very protective of me.
Oh, you're going to need more hits soon.
It's warm work.
Yeah. Do you think it's okay to have many spirits with you at all times?
I do. I mean, obviously, I'd be a hypocrite if I said, "Oh, you shouldn't have spirits around you," because I've got spirits. This is fucking Grand Central Station. There's spirits that hang out in my bedroom and watch over stuff, and there's a ton of them that just pretty much. There's full-on spirit doors where they're allowed to come and go in the ritual space downstairs. We do have some rules where, like, people who don't want to have random dead guys just sort of like looking over their shoulders. So largely we ask that they keep themselves downstairs. But if it's important, they'll come up and they'll hang out.
Okay, a couple of questions about Kyphi.
Yeah.
Well, what are you making? I might have given that one away.
I am making a variation on an ancient temple incense, the recipe of which appears on the walls of what is known as the laboratory room of the Temple of Edfu in Egypt. And I use that particular one because it doesn't only include the ingredients, it tells you the measurements of those ingredients, which is kind of important for making something like this. It looks kind of like brownie batter at the moment.
Do you think that spirits see us as dark shadows?
Huh. So here's my experience with that is in the spirit realm there's sort of this near and far perception where this gets into some really weird ideas about space and distance and movement. I'm going to do my best to explain how I perceive this. So I mentioned that we've got spirit doors and disembodied, so spirits that hang around downstairs in the ritual chamber. And when we do work, like there's the physical ritual chamber, which is also the library. So, you know, it's got all the bookshelves and everything and all the books. And there's the physical space of it. And there are moments where they can come into focus. And it feels to me like they come into focus by focusing on one of the people, one of the embodied people there, so that they use us almost as their anchor into our perceptual space, our sense of the physical world. Not so much that they're like, you know, getting into our skin, but they communicate, they connect, and through that connection are better able to focus on what we perceive as the physical world. But before that connection and before that coming into focus, there's a sense of being in a space between. And it's much more formless, and it's much less something that you would be able to perceive with your five physical senses. And it seems to not, it's a space between spaces, and a space that is not exactly a space. And it is a space of transition, so that travel is less about geography and more about intent and focus, like who they can connect to. And then by connecting to that person and focusing on that person, they're there where that person is without traveling miles, even though they've figuratively traveled miles. So when they are in that distant in-between state, it's like looking at the physical world. If you've ever been in deep water, looking up at the world beyond the surface of the water, it both feels very distant, and it's hard to focus on things. Like they're very wibbly, there's wavy, they're out of focus. That sense of distance, that sense of things not really being in focus, being muted, and yet seeming very bright, that is my experience trying to perceive the physical realm from that between space. It's kind of weird. People that you have a tie to, that you have a connection to, a pre-existing connection, come in to focus more clearly and are brighter. And many people who you have no connection to, who are not relevant to your perception, seem just sort of like smudges, like indistinct shadows. Like there's a sense of motion and stuff, like just sort of like the shuffling masses.
That's fascinating, because it makes me wonder about, I mean, shadow people. Like, maybe it's a two-way street.
Well, and that's one of the things, like shadow people. I know some people think that they're like trans-dimensional, interdimensional. Some people think that they're demonic. And my thing about spirits that appear in silhouette as shadow, I need to know a lot more about the experience before I'm willing to say it's a shadow person, in the sense that that is a discrete type of, a discrete category of thing, because a number of perfectly ordinary human spirits appear as shadows, as silhouettes, for a couple of different reasons. Some of which, one reason is you, the perceiver, are not ready or able to see them any more clearly yet. They, the spirit, are not ready or willing to show you who they are yet. Like they're holding back, or they're just not fully present yet. They're not fully engaged yet. There's a number of things that do it. They can consciously disguise themselves as well. And sometimes a loved one will do that because they don't want to scare you or make you feel sad by reminding you that they're dead. And so they sort of veil themselves. And that effect means that they just sort of look like this indistinct human shape.
Interesting.
So although shadow person has come to be a discrete category of being in modern paranormal parlance, a spirit that appears as a shadow is not in every case a shadow person. It may also be a person, a living human being who is projecting into the space. And that's a whole new wrinkle. But sometimes the spirits you're seeing may not be dead people at all, because it is indistinguishable. If you are perceiving someone who is adept at projecting themselves, either through astral travel or a different sort of out-of-body projection. So it's all really quite complicated. Again, to harp on the theme for the day, it's also why language and terminology is, I need to know like what the person means when they use it, what they experienced to make them want to choose that term, and what their perspective is, because it's gonna vary from thing to thing. For some people, you say shadow person, and they hands down, it's an inhuman thing that is interdimensional, and they are a specific sort of thing, and nothing else could possibly be this. And I'm just gonna say, in my experience, it's always more complicated than that. I don't take anything in this realm as absolute. The minute I try to say there's a hard definition for something, I find an exception. It's worse than the English language, really.
So there's a question, have you ever worked with Amy Allen? She seems to have a fair amount of demonic activity or interaction with demonic entities.
I have not, and I'll be honest, I've not watched their show. I make a point to try not to watch any of the paranormal shows if I can help it, except for the episodes that I'm on. And I mean, that might sound snobby, but the purpose is more because they investigate places, and I might also be called in on those investigations. And oftentimes, my role is as the medium to do like psychic work. I want to have as little front loading as possible. So I prefer to just not. What I watch instead are things like The Expanse and crime shows and Critical Role.
Yes. So much that. Oof. Okay. Are you cooled down enough to take some more?
I think I'm just gonna say bonsai and pour this in here.
Alrighty.
Lumps and Hall, of which there are many.
Oh, I see that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it will be warm the whole.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try to see if it boils down.
You and your cooking chopsticks.
Well, they don't scratch the metal.
Yep, they're very environmentally efficient. I appreciate it. Do you want me to scrape?
Yeah, that would be great. Please.
All right.
Give me 1 second, because this is actually getting warm. All right.
Use my years of experience at scraping brownie batter out of the brownie pot.
This is molten honey mixed with gugulo or gulu gum, which is Commiphora whitey, a Wightii, is the scientific name, and it is a relative of myrrh, sometimes also known as bdellium, Bdellium, or sweet myrrh.
Yeah. I can't reach up here. That's like, there we go.
Yeah, and please be mindful of all the metal, because it's really quite hot.
Oh, I am. Unlike you, I burn easily.
Yeah, I imagine this would involve a lot more blisters if I wasn't mostly fireproof.
Oh, look at that honey. All right, what do you think?
Yeah, that's as good as it's gonna get.
Okay.
I'm just gonna put that over there for the moment. Toss. Grab.
Yeah, more honey. Ooh. Even more honey.
Yeah. If you want to try to scoop that out of there, that would be great. Yeah. I kind of gave up because talking and Here, have a honey and bdellium covered chopstick.
All right, sounds like a tasty snack.
Right.
Oh,
this isn't as warm.
All right, I'm going to actually move this to a different burner, so I'm not just leaning forward.
Toasting yourself. All right, I just got a little.
Okay. All right.
Good deal.
All
Want to
right.
scrape me clean and then we'll go back to questions?
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. You said that there were some tougher questions.
Yeah, so there are a couple that I want to actually like mention trigger warnings before getting
Okay.
into them. The first question will be about miscarriages, and the second about
Okay.
suicide. So if either of those are triggers for you, it'll probably take call it 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how long Michelle answers. So
Okay. Yeah, that's
take a little break.
some intense stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't want to catch anybody unawares. Okay, so the first question. What are your thoughts on the concept that miscarriages may be souls who needed to feel love once more before fully reincarnating, and being carried for that short amount of time may help with that?
I could see that. I mean, sometimes I've also, I have a personal theory on some miscarriages where it's just the spirit and the body did not connect well. And they were somebody who was trying to incarnate after something that was very difficult, where they may be carrying damage on their subtle bodies, carrying damage and trauma spiritually. And it just was too soon. And so they wanted that person to be a parent, but they themselves were not ready. I also think that there's a process by which the spirit kind of gets woven in with and connected to the body, and that can vary. The time and the length of time that takes can vary. So I think that there's some truth to that, and I also think that it's not. Actually, I will say I have seen, by my personal belief and perception, an instance where a soul who was trying to incarnate caused a couple of miscarriages and really wanted to be born and just tried again. So, they may come through at a time when it is more likely to be workable, to be helpful. So there's that.
Okay, and the question about suicides is effectively, where do suicides go? Can they be around people who love them, or are they stuck?
My experience with suicides is they're only stuck in as much as if they are still really tangled up in their emotions and haven't worked through stuff, they may be stuck in that moment for a little while, but more often they end up around family members, and they work through it that way. I mean, it would be a pretty cruel universe that would ask us to, from our darkest moment in a life, then try to work through that alone. So I really, really don't believe that suicides get punished for basically having suffered terrible depression or some sort of terrible trauma that they simply couldn't heal from. I mean, I think that they're just placed in the best position for healing possible. Sometimes they're real angry, though. There was a woman who committed suicide at the hotel I worked at, and they didn't tell me that she committed suicide. I mean, it's kind of an emergency, and hotels don't like to talk about people who die on their properties, but they do a lot. And as it turns out, if you have a little, fairly cheap, hotel motel on a highway, not quite, just enough of a drive outside of a city where, you have that, late night thing and you just need to get the fuck away, and you drive until 3 a.m. and you stop at a hotel. This was the hotel. So we'd had 3 deaths in the place in as many years, all of which were likely to be this sort of thing. Long story short, I go in back to work after a little vacation, and there is a very angry woman just running around and causing trouble and fucking with the lights and fucking with the computers, and basically just screaming at me going, I thought it would be over. I thought nothing would be here. Why am I still here? And she was so pissed off.
Oh.
So
Yeah.
I had an understanding manager, and so the next morning I'm like, what's with the blonde chick with the bad dye job? Because like she was still so present with who she was. Like I could describe her down to her clothes. And he got this look because of course the owner had told him he was not allowed to talk about it. And I'm like, dude, she kept turning the computer off. The minute she figured out that she could fuck with shit, she was just all night long. And like, I don't want to kick her ass because she seems like she had a really bad weekend. But if she keeps fucking with me, I'm gonna hit back. Anyway, she settled down and pretty much sat with things. She was upset because she believed that if she killed herself, that would be it. And it didn't solve a damn thing for her, and she just had to kind of work through that.
Yeah. That honestly seems a lot more compassionate than the views that say if someone commits suicide, like, they'll never be around the people they love again.
Oh my god, like okay, so the Christian idea of suicide just really always sat poorly with me.
Yeah.
And the reason that my grandmother wasn't Catholic anymore was she had had miscarriages. Many miscarriages. And she had priests tell her to her face that her babies would forever be in limbo. She would never see them in heaven because they had never been baptized. Which led to, and again, still trigger warning for this, I had an Uncle Joey who lasted, I think, all of 2 days. He was born in December in the middle of a intense snowstorm. The National Guard had to be called out because, of course, he was born at home. She couldn't get to the hospital in time, and he was blue. So he was born with a heart problem. And what I know is Aunt Rita baptized him in the kitchen sink because since he wasn't stillborn, they weren't going to have another baby that they would never see in heaven. Now, how fucking cruel is that? Seriously. So I think that some of these interpretations have a lot more to do with humanity's limitations in imagination than they do with the way the universe actually works. So that's my opinion on that.
Thanks. Alrighty. So if you are back to non-triggery topics.
Back to non-triggery stuff, and I think now this is the like kind of brownie batter that I'm used to, which means I'm gonna be here for a while.
Okay, I'm glad we didn't add more wine.
No, I had a feeling it would just be a bad idea.
Yep. Okay. So if you're someone who does dream walking, what are some techniques that you can use to make sure that you come back to your own body afterwards?
I mean,
or is that not a concern?
I've never had a problem coming back to my own body. Like there's, I cannot. I mean, I could think of like maybe like a 1.0001% chance of something trying to keep you from being back there, but. So, if you travel, whether it's astral travel, dream walking, or anything else, okay, so this is going to be a little weird to wrap your head around. I know that when they describe like astral travel particularly, they're very clear on saying that there's a part that you are detaching your astral form, i.e. like inside of that your spirit from your body, and it's just connected by this little thread, and off you go. Tethered by your silver cord, and you don't want your silver cord to get cut because you'll get lost and yada yada yada. I think that is one conceptual way of approaching projection, and I don't think it works quite the way they think, because I don't think that you're completely out of your body at any point. I don't think that you have scooped it out and you're no longer attached to it. I think your mind is a lot bigger and more complicated than you realize, and you can be in multiple places at once, and you're just shifting your perception and focusing more on this side than on that side. So I think that you never fully leave. A part of you stays. And at least in my experiences of laying down and doing that kind of projection work, especially when I'm awake and using dream walking techniques, uh, if there's a loud noise in the room, if a fire breaks out, I am present enough to be aware of that, even though I'm also aware of being where I am at projecting and interacting at the same time. And I think it's just a matter of how much our brains are capable of processing for information. So if you think about the location of where your body is as one tab on your computer, and the location of where you are focusing your interaction as another tab on your computer, you've got both tabs open. You're just looking at one of them. It doesn't mean that this one's gone. I don't think you're ever really out of your body. A part of you is beyond it. But I also think that distance and travel is very different on that side. It's not so much that you have gotten out of your body and you have now taken a journey and you're walking away and like there's 100 miles between you and you. You're all you. You're all there. It's just really hard to wrap your head around. So it's easier to just let your focus be on the tab that's on the front and not think about this one over here.
Now, is that similar for out of body experiences? Like, I know for the ones that you've had.
Yeah.
Looking back, does it feel like you were both in your body and out of your body with that like point of perception shift?
Okay, so like crisis out of body experiences are a little bit different.
But at the same time, like if you go to sleep and
Yeah.
you wake up and you're in that place, I could see some similarities.
Yeah,
At
so
least from the person having the experience.
yeah, no, it's a good question and it's complicated. So I've had some spontaneous out of body experiences. I'll talk about two of them. One happened when I was 4, so it was I think right before my 4th or 5th birthday. Can't remember if it was 76 or 77, but anyway, I got this rocking horse for Christmas. I named him Duke. I hi-ho silvered away, both hands up, had been going a mile a minute on this thing. So of course, off I went, flew backwards off of the rocking horse, smacked my head, landed right on a marble top table, and knocked myself cold. I've got a pretty sizable scar back here from it. And at that age, it didn't even occur to me that this was an out-of-body experience. It was years later, talking about the experience with my mom, and just kind of going over it, that it, one of those like aha moments where you suddenly like, oh, I never thought about my perspective of some of what was going on. But I remember very distinctly, like everything that led up to this, I remember hi-ho silver away, and I remember, whew, and then I don't remember, like everything goes black for a little bit. And then my memory picks up in the driveway. So we had like this back porch and this other like bottom porch. My memory picks up as my mom is coming out the door, and she's got me in one of my baby blanket that an aunt had crocheted. And because it's fucking cold and it's December and it's a snowstorm, and we had this big halogen lamp on the back porch because it was pretty wild where we were at, so it was to keep the critters away. And the snow's coming down. You can see the snow in the light of the lamp, and I can see my mom hasn't even put on a coat. She's still wearing just her sweater, no hat. Her hair's loose. She's got her glasses on, and she's got this little thing that she's holding. And Aunt Rita has come out and warmed up her old green car that I always just felt was the ugliest damn thing. I had a thing for cars even then. And I see Aunt Rita kind of like preceding my mom and getting into the car, and like, and mom walking in. And it took me until I was in my 20s to go, I'm watching from up above this whole thing.
Yeah.
I'm not in that body.
Now, I guess my question is, did you feel a connection to that body?
In that moment, no.
Interesting.
I was not.
You weren't aware of the separation.
Yeah, I was simply watching what was happening. I was not concerned. I was not scared. I felt no pain. I did not feel like I was passed out. I was just this detached observer looking at this moment. And somewhere after that moment, I kind of like dipped back into and in and out of consciousness at that point. And much more clearly in the body and in consciousness when somebody's like shining some lights in my eyes to see if I've concussed myself. I made him. I got to keep all of his little pen lights.
Ooh, you really are like a cat.
Anyway, there was another time, and this is where, okay, so this will explain my theory for this particular type of what I'm going to call a ripcord out of body experience. I was driving on my way to that hotel once, and I crashed my car into a deer, or the deer crashed into me. It's on the highway. I was going 75 miles an hour on 71, just to the exit at 18. About maybe, I don't know, 50 feet before. Like I'll point out the place to you. So the deer was coming this way, and so it smacked into the front of the car. It bounced off of the front of the car. It came straight at the windshield. I'm not sure how or why, but it came straight at the windshield and then just sort of veered off over the car.
That's good.
But at the moment of impact, my perspective did that like up and back, which is how I saw the deer arc end over end over end, because I hit that deer really, really hard. But I was just aware enough of going, I could die, and I'm going to get out before things get real ugly. But it also meant that like, but like the body was still there, and I was still like, oh, still driving the car, still okay. We're going to now decelerate and pull over, and everything's fine. But it let me take. Now the thing is this sounds also like dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a dissociative thing. And I would identify it purely as psychological dissociation. As somebody who's got a lot of PTSD as a small person, I do dissociate in certain traumatic moments where like I just get a sense of distance.
But that also doesn't explain how you could see a deer.
And that's the problem. And also with the deer thing, maybe I imagined it, but with my mom's experience, like I was able to confirm down to like the color of her sweater, what she grabbed to wrap me in, like all of that. Those are bits of information that if it was just pure dissociation, I wouldn't have had.
I'm glad you're not dead.
I mean, I was fine. I checked the car, looked for the deer, saw that the car was drivable, got back in the car, drove the rest of the way to work, came into work. People are like, hey, Michelle, how you doing? Blah, blah. I'm like, I hit a deer. Let me call the insurance agency. And they're like, what? I'm like, I hit a deer. You're in shock. I'm like, no, I'm not in shock. I'm just annoyed. Please let me call the insurance agent because I think I just completely totaled my car. How did you get here? It was just up at the exit and it didn't blow up.
Downhill, coasting. Woo.
I mean, it started, but yeah, it fucked that car.
Have you ever been attacked while you were out of body? And can that be more or less dangerous than your run-of-the-mill spiritual attack?
So I was really sure that nothing was around that would attack me for stuff like that. And I have two fellows, or had for the longest time, two disembodied who would watch at either side of my bed. And I was having a conversation with them of like, guys, do you always have to stand there? Like, what's up with this? And they're like, well, we're here to like guard you and make sure that nothing bad happens. And I'm like, come on, what bad is gonna happen? Like, what's gonna go on? And I annoyed them enough that they were like, fine, find out. So proceed to the next day or two, and they're not there. They're AWOL, off doing their thing. And I do my usual dreamwalky thing, and there is this point where it feels like something has grabbed, not physically, but like grabbed my feet and is pulling me by my feet out of the bed elsewhere. and there was a bit of a tug of war. Again, not physically my feet, but like me out of my body and trying to like drag me somewhere. And I got a sense that it wasn't very pleasant and not necessarily something I wanted to tangle with. So, I fought back. And at that point, I kind of went guiltily and apologized to my two bed guardians and was like, oh, okay, well, I can definitely fight that fight, but it's really nice that I don't have to most of the time. So good on you, do your work, that's cool. So on one hand, out of body, you are on the same turf, you are on the same footing as something that you might be battling. And so sometimes when I am trying to handle a really unpleasant spirit in somebody's house, I will project to the location and basically deal with it as if I were a spirit, deal with it in spirit, because it's much easier to just go toe-to-toe with it. But it is really helpful to have some spirit guardians, allies, whatever you want to call them, on your side who are willing to help out and have your back so that you're not doing all the work.
Do you work with vampires who are disembodied?
I mean, yes, and that's a complicated distinction because all spirits need to take energy. And in that sense are vampiric by most people's idea of that word. It's just a question of like how much and what type of energy and what their source is. People are the easiest source. Now, do I deal with things like me who are disembodied? Yes, that's exactly why I call the disembodied by a specific term as opposed to spirit guides or spirit guardians, because by my perception, they are, if they were in bodies, they would be just, they would be like me. I've heard some little group call them undead gods, which I think gives them way more credit, because
I'm sure they would love that name.
they would love, yeah, seriously, could you imagine on Chemset just strutting around going, I'm an undead god, baby?
Worship me.
Well, Chemset wouldn't be full of himself, but Rasa sure would be.
Oh. Let's see. Would you say that astral projection and psychic dreamwalking are the same thing? Are they related?
I distinguish them. I distinguish them as different based on one, that they accomplish the same thing. Astral projection goes out to get in that traveling, and dreamwalking goes in to get out. So you're using your interior world and the realm of dream, or at least the in-between state of hypnagogia as your vehicle for stepping beyond, where astral travel is a little bit more pushed that way. Like it really...
Don't they both end up?
They both end up in the same spot, and it's really
okay. So it's more about method than it is about end result.
What method are you using? What steps do you use to get to the same place? And I'd actually put remote viewing in there as a third option, because it's different from astral projection, because you are trying to literally just perceive at a distance
as
without
to
the
project
sense.
Yep. To that. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Joseph McMonigal has some pretty neat books on the remote viewing process and programs that they did in the United States military. And I believe, okay, don't quote me on this one, but I think in one of the ones of his that I'd read, part of the reason they wanted remote viewing to be more a point of perception rather than astral travel is since this was covert observation, essentially psychic spy work, and the assumption was that other countries, other governments had their own psychic programs and could feasibly perceive and should have been theoretically looking out for people spying on them psychically. Your goal as a remote viewer was to leave no trace. So to have no sense of your actual presence, no astral body, no astral footprint, which makes a lot of sense given like what they were trying to do it for.
Okay, so a pair of questions for you. Would that connection between the soul or the energy body and the physical body that you were talking about with out-of-body experiences, what would happen with that if the physical body then apported? And what do you think happens when apportation takes place?
I've never heard of a physical body. Well, oh God, no, I can't really say that exactly. I'm not sure if it qualifies as apportation, but I used to do, still sometimes do like travel magic, where, you know, you kind of hit a point on a long distance ride and all points are one point. You just sort of like shave off an hour and a half worth of driving, and I never really thought too hard about what that must look like, where you're sort of like in one spot and then suddenly you're 100 miles ahead. But that's probably apporting, teleporting. Don't want to think about it too hard because then it probably won't work.
Oh no.
So this gets into like some complicated stuff about geometry. Our physical body is in the three-dimensional world, and I think that what we perceive as spirit and the subtle reality is an additional dimension, not in the sense of an alternate dimension. Let me be very clear that by dimension I'm talking purely in geometric senses of 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, 4. Not the weird thing of like the 4th dimension is time, or there's a couple of new age ways of looking at things where I think they posit like 13 different dimensions and each of them is a different sort of alternate reality. This is purely a different direction. I mentioned this in my energy healing class, the metasurgery one. There's a book called Flatland, which was really quite influential on me. It's very short. It is a fictionalized story that teaches you about Euclidean geometry and the concept of dimensions and what it must look like when something from something that has an existence in a dimension 1 step higher than yours looks like to you. So the main character in this book lives on a Euclidean plane, only 2-dimensional. He's just a two-dimensional critter. And he is contacted by a sphere, by a being that exists in 3 dimensions, so our perceptual reality. Well, this sphere attempts to like communicate with him, but at first, all of the talking to this little guy is coming from, he can't see what's talking to him because he only perceives along an X and a Y axis. And this is a thing that moves along Z. And so it's over here in a direction he cannot possibly conceive, and yet it is able, because it lives in 3 dimensions, to interact with his reality. Well, to me, that explained an awful lot about ghosts, the subtle reality, and fucking everything else. Especially at the moment where this sphere tries to appear to him, and there's times when he can hear it, but he can't see it, and then it intersects his little 2-dimensional plane, and it is, as it moves through, it's like it starts as a point, and it moves through his space in a way that doesn't make any sense by the laws of reality as he understands them, the laws of direction and motion as he understands them and is capable and wired to perceive them. And for me, that explains an awful lot about what we call paranormal phenomenon. I think it's stuff that's moving from a direction that we can't physically perceive at all, and it intersects our space. And the fact that it doesn't follow a lot of easy rules and seems like it's over here and then it's over here, and then it doesn't seem to have like actually like crossed distance to be there, but how did it do that? I think we're talking about something that would make a lot of sense if we were the little 2-dimensional critter in Flatland, dealing with something that was moving in directions we were not wired to perceive, something from 4th dimension. So long story short with that is, if we move in that additional dimension, we may not be able to consciously perceive it or even process the experience. I still think that on some level we do exist there, And we are able to sometimes move in that direction, even though our brains are not really good at making any sense out of what just happened. I hope this will be okay. There's still some lumps in here. Not done.
I can smash them. Oh yeah, no, I know we'll be here for a couple more hours.
Yeah, we'll be here for a while.
Yeah, I know there are a couple people who have been asking questions. We have like a 10-question backlog right now. So do not ask them more than once. We're more likely to answer them if you just ask them once and then wait patiently.
Yeah, Illyria is pretty
don't
good at
stop
keeping
chat.
track of y'all.
Okay, so I'm gonna do another bit of trigger warning potentially.
Okay.
This question was asked a little while ago, and I wanted to give us a chance to cool down from the last round of
Trigger warning,
potentially
yeah.
intense stuff. But here we go. Does a 3-month-old baby killed by his father go to heaven?
Well, I certainly don't think he goes to hell. It would depend on whether or not you believe in heaven. From my perspective, does his soul persist? Absolutely. Does it go somewhere enjoyable so it can recover from that? Fuck yes. At 3 months old, he's not really likely to have been too emotionally entangled or invested. So it's less likely that you're going to end up with a haunting by the soul itself, by that spirit itself. Could the event leave a stain where some investigators or psychics might go in and pick up on this event? Yes. But that does not mean that that poor soul is just stuck there doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. That's kind of a misapprehension of a lot of hauntings. The example I usually use is Gettysburg. A lot of people have an awful lot of experiences on that battlefield, and one of the most common ones is they see the battle replay with all of the soldiers on both sides, like over and over and over again, like a loop in time. The mistake to make there is to assume that the spirits of every single soldier who fought and died on that battlefield is somehow caught in time reliving this event over and over again, that their intelligent souls are still there. Logically, if we think about it, not every person who was involved in that battle died. So it doesn't make sense that they're stuck there in that way. What you are seeing, rather, is the imprint of the incredibly traumatic event, all of the emotion, all of the heightened experience just burnt into the place. And that is what's replaying. So they themselves, as intelligent beings, are not stuck there. There are a few scattered soldiers who do haunt that battlefield and haunt the areas around it, people who are connected to that battle. But they are exceptions, not the rule. And that is something to keep in mind. Many things that people will take for hauntings, in the sense of these are discrete, intelligent, individual souls, beings who died on the location. Way more often what you're dealing with is what they call a residual haunting, what I used to call an echo or a memory ghost. The imprint of the experience, but not the person. Would be a pretty shitty existence, is every time somebody died a terrible way, that they were then stuck reliving that moment over and over and over again. That's just cruel.
Yeah, there are a lot of entrenched beliefs that I think are more about people's ability to control religious experience.
Yeah,
and they are about reflecting reality in any sort of energetic sense.
Well, and a lot of our understanding of what haunts and how things haunt, and we have to recognize the role folklore has played in our understanding. So there are a lot of folk beliefs that have come down to us without being carefully examined as such. A really popular one that we got largely from the Greek and Roman world was if a person was improperly buried, that their soul would come and haunt you. So if somebody was just murdered and their body was stuffed at the side of the road, they would haunt that area until they got their proper funerary rites. And that actually ties back to some very key beliefs throughout the ancient world, at least the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world, where if you did not give the proper rites to the dead, they would come and basically hunt you down and demand them. Oh, you just, I love you so much. You anticipate all of my needs.
Your needs are really simple. Basically, I make tea for you 3 times a day.
Yeah. All right, I think this is to the point where I will add the dragon's blood.
Exciting.
3/4 of a cup of powdered dragon's blood. My cup is
Very
full of
funny.
stuff,
Yep.
so I'm gonna use a 1/2 cup over here. I ground the dragon's blood ahead of time because I wasn't sure what kind of a chore that was going to be. It turned out it was pretty good. Pretty easy.
So, can I ask you a question while you're doing that?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it possible to see a spirit like a flash or a burst of light and then just moving energy?
Yes.
This person doesn't see well psychically, so to speak.
Yes. It's been my... Different people perceive spirits differently, and there's a couple of different reasons for that. There's your ability. You as the perceiver have different ways of perceiving, and different senses that will be like your way in interpreting that experience. And different spirits present themselves differently as well. So some things may show up as shadow, some things may show up as light, some things may only be a sound or a presence, an emotion. TV makes a lot of the very visual stuff, and I'm responsible for this to some extent as well, which is to say that my experiences, I process stuff in an incredibly intensely visual way. So when I'm describing my experiences, it sounds like I literally see somebody standing in the same room with me, and that's not what I'm perceiving. I'm interpreting my perception in a visual way. But on top of that, it then makes people think that if they don't see a ghost, that they're not psychic, that they're not perceiving it. And that's not how it works. Most people perceive a haunting through emotion, through the feel of some presence. And that is no less perceptive, no less psychic than what I do. It just means that you don't get quite as much detail as I do, only because I've been training to do this for like 30 plus years. And like, so there's a lot of work I've done to like really learn how to process, learn how to interpret what I'm picking up, and also to trust it. Because I'll tell you, like, you probably get little flashes of things and you discount them because you're pretty sure that it's just your imagination, or you're making stuff up, or you're reading too much into it, or all of the little like self-defeating things that society and friends and family have kind of drilled into you.
All right.
Could you ask me a question and then get me a 1/4 cup?
Yeah.
A middle one out of there.
Do you do private readings?
I do not do private readings. Sam, I am. Why do I not do private readings, especially not like just straight up psychic readings? I have a hard time putting a price on that work. And I also put a lot more value in teaching people how to do these things for themselves. So I'm much more inclined to teach you how to do readings for yourself and how to hone your own abilities. I am not always comfortable, personally, doing that work for people.
This is a 1/4 cup.
That's
Did
all.
not say a half.
I meant 1/4 cup,
Oh.
and if I said 1/2 cup, I apologize.
Well, perfect.
So this is the one that I need because the 1/2 cup's right here.
Well, there's what you needed, even though you didn't ask for it. It's fine. Where did you keep it?
Probably in the washing machine, or the dishwasher, that I keep calling a washing machine today. Like,
Oh no.
for whatever reason.
I mean, it is a machine. And
It is a machine of washing, so.
I can see where that might occur. Can you pass me a tea bag?
Sure.
Or just a box?
I'll pass you the box since my hands are covered in dragon's blood. And my palate is sensitive enough that I would actually taste it in my tea. And I would prefer not to.
All right. 6:47. 5 minutes. We come back and make the tea all the way. Okay, we have a question. So, if you are doing a reading on someone from a distance, what sort of things can you do to make sure that you don't bring any of their energy back with you? Like, how do you close that connection down after like getting in there and reading their energy and then going back to your own space?
Actively doing some internal work of like detaching, anchoring yourself to your own space. So a little bit of like centering and grounding. For me, what I do is I picture coming back. I find my center and I am actively like letting go. And it can take a little bit. It's not like immediately I drop my perception of them. I often have kind of like this split screen moment where I can still feel them. And so I identify where that's still clinging and I shake it off. I let it go. I actively let it go. Sometimes it still clings a little bit anyway. So if grounding and centering and shielding doesn't work, I make a point of changing what I'm doing. So I am no longer, like I get up from where I did the work, I go do something completely mundane. Maybe I eat some chocolate, maybe I have some tea. If I really can't shake it off, I take a shower because that is such an intense, like physical sensation thing for me. It helps me clear everything.
Neat. Would you ever consider doing a guided meditation to help people learn to astral project?
Yeah, I mean, I could do that.
I'm just going to make
Yeah.
a note here.
I mean, I would probably frame it more as dream walking because I'm more familiar with, and frankly connect better to the mechanics of that. But for projecting out, and the thing is about dream walking, you don't have to be asleep to do it. You can do it very effectively from hypnagogic states, which are just altered states of consciousness. So basically that nice light, relaxed and focused state that you get in if somebody is doing a good job with their little visualization leading you, doing a meditation, that's your launching pad.
And is there any place outside of the Psychic Vampire Codex that you teach or talk about psychic vampires and feeding?
I have an extensive section in Raven Caldera's Ethical Psychic Vampire, although it is anonymous. I think if you're familiar with my writing, it'll be pretty obvious who it is. Pretty sure I've got something in one of Lee Harrington's books. Actually, I know I do. I'm trying to remember which one it is. And I think it's called Hungry for You, is the chapter. Let's see. There used to be 1,000,001 articles online. I'm trying to remember if I think in Path of Winding Words, I did not include the vampire articles. There was a collection called Sacred Hunger, which is out of print now. So as far as like a book devoted to it exclusively, it's just a Psychic Vampire Codex. I have been considering doing some follow-up work to that. I give people a voice to their own perspectives and some of their own different techniques, including blood drinkers, in Vampires in Their Own Words. So that one is a collection of not just me. I like introduce people to it. And I give many people who were involved in the community about 10, 15 years ago a platform because not all of them, had the same level of access that I did to get books published.
Oh dear.
What?
You know what I did?
What?
Not put Vampires in Their Own Words on the website, even though we have a few copies right now.
Huh.
So maybe that's why nobody's buying them.
Probably.
The things you find out during live streams.
It is also, actually like really dated at this point. I had started to do a vampires in their own words too, and the vampire community is a hot mess, and there's just a lot of just stupid. I mean, there's always been a lot of politics and wrangling and whatnot, but at the point where everybody just started tearing me down for the very fact that I even was going to do this book on my own dime, on my own time, giving people who weren't going to get published otherwise the opportunity, like I threw my hands up in the air and said, fuck it. So unless things change drastically within the community and a lot of the toxic stuff stops, like if it doesn't fucking stop, I'm unlikely to do another book with that stuff in mind. Like about psychic vampirism, sure, but giving the community a platform, the community needs to fucking sit in a corner and think about what it's done for a little while, not just for me, but like to one another. Like the toxicity and the wrangling is out of hand.
Okay. When you're doing healing work, do you feel whatever is ailing the person you're working on? And if so, how do you deal with that?
It depends on the type of healing work I'm doing, how I feel it. By the question, I suspect what the person's describing is if the person is feeling nauseous, there are some people who do healing work and they experience that nausea themselves. Or basically their body becomes an echo of what the other person is experiencing. My approach to healing work doesn't work that way. It's a little bit more like remote viewing the person's problems. So I perceive what's going on and I process it more intellectually than I necessarily do. Now, when I was very young and working on like honing these abilities, I forget if it was a book or a person that I'd learned, like their idea of healing was like you take their pain into you, and that's just a bad plan. You don't want to do that. You want to take the pain out of them, but you want to remove it and grab it in the same way that you might poison from a snake bite. If you suck it out, you don't swallow, you spit. Not to put too fine a point on it. If you have problems echoing, like if part of your natural way of perceiving how a person feels, this is something that just happens for some people. Their way of processing psychic perception is to feel it very viscerally in their own body. So first, make sure that that is not happening simply because you're taking their stuff on. If it's happening because you are resonating, you're echoing it with them, if you can then use it to then focus on the problem, but make sure that you, once you're like, okay, oh, I need to look over here, something's wrong here, make sure that you are able to then focus on them, but not feel it in you.
I need sugar for your food. Thank you.
If you have too much trouble doing healing work, like being overwhelmed with what the person themselves is suffering, I would recommend working on something called filtering. Filters are a type of shield where instead of blocking yourself off entirely, because if you're doing healing work, you do want some energetic interaction between you and the person, but you want something that will filter out the stuff that you don't want to come through to you. So you want to be able to interact with them, project your energy to them, grab and harness stuff, but also let the gunk not come into you. And I hope that helps.
Okay.
Okay, yes, I hear you hissing.
Oh, goodness. So, when you've been burning Kyphi, have you or anyone you know of experienced past life memories during that burn?
Yes, that was originally one of the reasons that we put it together, was to see if we made it by the book, what kind of a potent memory trigger it might be. And yes, also the whole process of making Kyphi has been an interesting experience of little flashbacks to things. So I believe that I've definitely had some echoes while doing this. This particular batch is an exercise in this because I made a number of substitutions that we'll see if this turns out the way I expect it to. Because this one is informed, at least in part, by what in certain pagan and metaphysical circles is known as UPG, unverified personal gnosis. I think I know what I'm doing, and I'm going off of my intuition in a couple of these substitutions, but there is no, is not as like hard research as like I can point to this thing that's like literally taken off of the temple walls of Edfu. I try very hard to make a pretty clear line when I'm doing, I have researched this, maybe guided by my instincts, but here is the actual thing that it's led me to, kind of along the lines of like the earlier conversation about police work. You can use the psychic stuff to point you in the direction, but still do the actual investigation work. Very rarely am I comfortable departing entirely to, I don't necessarily have the research to back it up, but I still have a feeling that this is how it works. A couple of the substitutions in here, including the dragon's blood, are totally that. Like Bedelium appears in a later, I think Plutarch has a recipe that he references of Kyphi, and he mentions Bedelium, so sweet myrrh. And orris root is mentioned, and a couple of other ones, but not dragon's blood anywhere. So.
Hey, here's a question. I was told that a baby is protected from spirits until age 3. How true is that?
It depends on the culture you're referencing, because so we have the wealth of Lilith amulets that have come down to us from the Jewish tradition, because it was widely believed that children up to the age of 3 or 4 were more vulnerable, were exceedingly vulnerable to being attacked by spirits. Lilith in particular, who was known for just being jealous and striking out at humanity because of the mythology associated with her in the rabbinical Jewish tradition. And so there were all of these things that you would put up on the cribs to prevent the child from being attacked by Lilith and her minions. And it's not just rabbinical Judaism that has that belief. There are a lot of things that I learned in fairy lore, of stuff that you put on an infant's crib to keep the fairies away, to keep it from being taken as a changeling, to keep it from being poked and pinched and otherwise harassed by spirits. So it depends on your belief system. It depends on your cultural background. If you want to know my actual take on it, I've had to be called in on a couple of occasions to set up wards and protections on children. It's my experience that things that are malevolent do not differentiate. I find it particularly vile when they go after something that is that defenseless. And that is when I pull out all the stops, and I get particularly aggressive myself in my own techniques for dealing with it. Usually I will meet a spirit halfway and kind of have a parley and talk and go, all right, can we come to an agreement to, like, maybe you go somewhere else, or maybe you just stick to this part of the house, but I at least try to see it from their perspective. But if they're fucking with kids or with pets, I kind of go straight to beating on them. Not the kids or the pets, the spirits.
Okay, here's a question, sort of more about Kyphi ingredients. What do you think of sweetgrass?
I mean, it's interesting. It has an interesting history, a lot of Native American lore, and it never really resonated for me. I picked some up out of curiosity, like anybody else who'd been exposed to the idea of smudging through the New Age community, it just didn't feel like it was for me. So, take of that what you will. I think that it is very useful within the right context. But I also think that one of the things to consider with sweetgrass and white sage and Palo Santo is, we're borrowing these from other cultures where in that culture they are incredibly important. There's a great deal of sacred lore, and you understand from in the context of the culture why these are important and why these are sacred. And I think it's important to do that work first before just sort of willy-nilly picking it up and expecting it to fix your space. And I think there's a lot of value in exploring other approaches to cleansing. One of my favorite ones is something that you encounter in hoodoo, where you just literally clean your fucking house. You use vinegar water. I think it's Three Thieves vinegar water.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the plague years. But vinegar has a lot of, I really wonder, because technically the most potent European-centered cleansing thing is vinegar. But it's nasty. I mean, it's vinegar. It smells bad.
Great.
It does not smell good at all. And so, like, I could see where people are just like, maybe there's something better than this.
I mean, I've definitely heard of vinegar like being infused with things that smell better.
Well, that's what Three
Three
Thieves. Yeah. I think it's interesting to explore. I mean, at least I enjoy exploring stuff and just kind of like figuring out like what's the background from this, what's the maybe embedded in folklore science behind this. I mean, for the ancient Egyptians and a lot of the ancient world, frankincense and myrrh were used widely, but at this point we know both of these have antibacterial, antiviral. There's some not quite 100% proven to my satisfaction or medical satisfaction suggestion that frankincense may have some anti-cancer effects. And like they weren't just used because they were symbolic. They weren't just used because they smelled good. They were used because they worked. Sage also has some antibacterial qualities. Thyme is another one. It's where the active ingredient for Listerine, named for Lister, who pretty much is the reason why, surgeons wash their hands.
I just have to find it.
I feel if I'm not careful, I'm going to have a Kwai Chang Caine moment with this.
I'm missing the reference, but that's fine. Okay, yes, here it is. Do you have any ideas for how people can overcome religious conditioning that they went through when they were kids?
So, funny story, I've been having so many questions from people about shadow work that I've started really thinking about how would I make a workbook for shadow work. Because shadow work is just kind of deconstructing your assumptions, the assumptions you've been handed. And part of that is the religion in which you were raised. It doesn't mean that you have to reject that religion so much as you should examine what you've been handed by that religion. And I think, actually, especially because of the moment in history we find ourselves in, we should examine all of the assumptions that we've been handed by society, by culture, by religion, by the political party we were raised in, by all of it, and really come to the conclusion of what do we want to be our values? What do we want to be our beliefs? And again, it doesn't mean that you have to reject stuff, but far too often we're handed assumptions. We don't even realize it's an assumption. We don't even realize that it was given to us, and we don't question it. We just react to it. Like locking your doors when you go through a neighborhood with people of a certain color, because I was definitely brought up with that. But that's an assumption. It's a pretty erroneous one, really. Um, so how do you do this deconstruction? You start asking questions. I would say first, what did this religion teach me? Like what beliefs do I have about myself and the world because of the religion in which I was raised? And expect to fill a couple of pages. Actually make this sort of like an ongoing journaling process, because you'll find that there's a lot of stuff above and beyond like the really obvious ones. You know, there's the soul exists, that God exists, that sin exists, that we're going to get punished, that heaven and hell exist, which means by extension there's only this life, and that's all we get, and if we fuck it up, then we're screwed. But actually, like, really look at the other parts of it. That if here's one that I have encountered in some Christians that just kind of annoys me, because they haven't thought about it all the way through. Is if Christ died for your sins, it means that you're forgiven, and it's from a bumper sticker. Christians aren't good, only just forgiven, which for some people gives them license to do whatever the fuck they want because they're still forgiven. And even if you don't actively try to like rules lawyer it and say, well, you know, I can be this flawed person, but I'm still forgiven because I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, there's this sort of low-key thing for some people of, it doesn't matter what I do, I don't have to work to be a good person because God's got my back, and if I just say I believe in Christ, it'll all be good.
Yeah, that seems like such a bad understanding of how any of that.
And I know not everybody takes it to that extent, but examining like the assumptions that maybe get some people there. You know, asking, do I want to be a good person because I want to be a good person, or am I being a good person out of fear that I'm going to go to hell, or am I doing whatever I want because I've been taught that I'm forgiven anyway? Like really asking questions, and asking hard questions. Like they're going to be uncomfortable.
Sometimes it can help to ask them when you're talking with a therapist.
Not all therapists, I think, are comfortable like delving into like the religious aspect of stuff. It depends on the therapist.
Well, and also the methodology that they're using.
Yeah.
Because some will be all about helping you explore stuff that's painful from the past.
There's a couple of really good workbooks on like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a fun deck about that too. It's also about deconstructing mostly attitudes toward like emotions and relationships, but it gives you an idea of like how to do that kind of work. All right.
Sorry.
I'm going to do some UPG here. I think I'm going to put in some benzoin as my final.
Interesting. How is that UPG? Or unverified personal gnosis? Is it just the sense that it's needed?
My sense is it needs a little bit.
Okay.
It had 3 tablespoons of it, and I wasn't sure at the time if there's one ingredient that I left out that I was just like, this doesn't work, and that was less unverifiable personal gnosis and more my nose going, this does not work with this scent profile.
It's unverifiable personal
noses.
Oh. Noses. Yes, unverifiable personal noses.
Wow. This is what I live with.
And you wanted to marry me.
I did. I'll fight for the right to do it.
Humor. Oh, you're welcome, everybody.
Wow.
I
mean, like,
at this, that one.
I can smell mostly the cinnamon and the dragon's blood. I don't smell the bdellium as much as I would have expected.
I think the benzoin is right behind you.
Yeah. Yeah, I brought it over here just in case. I had a feeling like this is the direction I was going to go.
Mightn't it be verifiable, though?
I mean, it would be verifiable if it works out. Like,
yeah.
Also, I like experimenting. But no, this feels like it calls for. Need to wipe that little girl off.
Mhm. Alrighty. Here is another little mini question. Or maybe not, who knows? Have you ever felt a pulse of energy from the earth?
Yes. Have I felt a pulse of energy from the earth or from something that felt like it was connected to the earth? Yes. Actually, I had a full-on, like, mystical, life-changing experience with what I firmly believe was a land spirit communicating to me when I was 17.
Hmm.
I'll tell the story. Trigger warning, suicide.
Hmm.
I say a lot of things about growing up, and I gloss over the parts that sucked because I learned a lot of really good things from my grandmother, and I learned a lot of really bad things from my grandmother, and she was a very complicated person. And by the time I was 17, I was real done with a lot of it. So in January, around my 17th birthday, so this was 1990, there is a park near where I live, where I grew up in Hinckley, and it has what's called whips ledges. These, sometime back, like in prehistoric times, there was a fantastic earthquake here that just like took a whole bunch of like the bedrock and stuff and just chucked it up. And so these ledges are like all this stone and whatnot, and like the local ROTC rappels down it and trains people and everything. And there's the bottom of the ledges and the top of the ledges. And long story short, I went there to jump off and kill myself. Now let's not go into the fact that I probably mostly would have broken a leg. Like let's be honest, this wasn't a well thought out plan. But I was done. And I wanted to like fly one last time. Like I was being real goth about it. But also the psychic stress, the mental stress was real. Um, and so I went, and this was before global warming really took hold. So it had started to be that January wasn't snowy, which was kind of new. So it's a gray January day. There's no leaves on any of the trees. I'm in my very goth way reflecting on how it's so very appropriate that it's such a gray day, and there's this mist and the sky is leaden, and and I'm just sort of like walking to the edge of the ledges. It's a little bit of a long hike to get there. And as I come around one of the bends, everything is gray and it's wet, and so like all the tree trunks are black, and it's the stone and the trees are like black and monochrome, and the whole world is monochrome. And then I get to the rocks, and they are alive with lichen and moss. Like they are a vibrant, brilliant green. And a cardinal zips across the path and like hangs out. And so like there's suddenly this burst of color. And just the look of it gives me pause. And then I don't have words for what I experienced next. I didn't process it as words. And I was raised Catholic, so there was a moment where I was like, pretty sure that's not God. But there was an intelligence that reached up and communicated with me, that spoke, but in something bigger than words, in something that was emotion and feeling. And I spent the next couple of days, honestly, the next couple of years, trying to distill it into words. It was very gentle with me, but it was also very like forceful, very firm. And it was pretty clear that what I was thinking about was a very bad idea and very unfair to a lot of things, and very short-sighted, and I shouldn't do it. And I should instead focus on the fact that there is all of this bright life in the middle of what looks like death, and that winter always leads into spring and summer, that there's, no matter how much it looks like you've lost, there's a point where you will come back from it. And things might not look the same, and they may not have the shape that you want them to have, but it's not just doom and gloom.
Hmm.
And I mean, it was deeper than that. And I'd had communications with spirits at that point. I was really conflicted about like what I thought about them. Not from a Catholic perspective, but much more from a scientific perspective. Like psychologically, I'm like, I spent a lot of time going, is this psychosomatic? Is this all in my head? Am I hallucinating? Am I making things up? Am I actually just, early schizophrenia and I'm hearing voices? So that was sort of like the mindset that I had. And this was so big and so profound and so clearly not me talking to me. It was very obviously something outside of me, and it felt deep and incredibly old, and not good or evil, just huge, just real. And I went to the edge of the ledges. I looked over. I had a sit and a think, and went home and I wrote a bunch of stuff about it. And I took the direction of life that I have now. And part of it would be that ring that I have, which you usually see me wearing, but since I was grinding stuff, I took off. But that was where this came from shortly after, like my promise to myself to just live my path. Regardless of what people said or thought, regardless of what kind of shit was thrown at me. High school sucked.
Yeah, it's a familiar story.
So, if you're ever in a place, I won't, not to put too fine a point on it, but I've definitely, like, I've gone through depression through my life. Like, it has been a thing. So I get it. And that wasn't the only time that I had at least some suicidal ideation, but it was certainly the only time that I had a plan and was in my own kind of boneheaded way very determined to do it. I say boneheaded not just because it was just a bad idea at the time, but I've gone to those ledges since. I've looked down. Like, unless I dove and like took a header, there was no way that was going to actually like be anything but incredibly inconvenient.
And very painful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like definitely enough to break bones.
It would have sucked.
Like 25, 30 feet, I think it might be.
Yeah, it's not enough to do anything other than really inconvenience me.
But I don't think that lessens the seriousness of
No.
the message either.
Yeah. So
It's a lot.
So that was my thing.
Yeah.
So I have spoken to a land spirit. I've taken people there since. I still communicate with it. I don't have a name for it. It's not something I could project a gender on. It is there. It is old. It's weaker than it used to be because the land is suffering. One of my favorite things was taking Christopher Penczak to go talk to it. That was cool.
Fun times. So, do you have any tips or approaches on how to build a relationship so that you can get a spirit guardian or spirit ally? And also, do you want me to take a turn starring?
No, we're starting to get to the point where it's like stiffening up though, and
Okay, cool.
the benzoin helped. Like that seems to have been the turning point. I might still put one more tablespoon in there. If you have ancestors, I would first put the request out to ancestors, not necessarily like people. You don't have to know your ancestors. You don't have to have had them in your family. And I would extend ancestor to include the spirit equivalent of found family. They don't necessarily have to be bloodline ancestors. There may be people, spirits, who, like, in their lives, there's some affinity, some echo of what you've gone through and what your lessons are this time that they resonate with, that they think they can help with, or that they might be they might want to help guide you through. So what I would first do is make a little space in your home, if you have like a personal shrine or a place where you meditate, a personal altar, make a little space for inviting ancestors or guides and spend a little time with it and just sort of see what kind of sense you get if there is someone or some ones who answer. And be kind, be compassionate, be humble, don't demand. Be open to communication that may not be as clear as like words in your head. I will say that my experience at 17 was a little bit, extraordinary. But listen and put the invitation out there. Be clear with your boundaries that, of course, you want someone or some ones who are willing to help, who are good to help for you, who are suited to you, and who have your best interests at heart. And, before you commit to anything that like might respond, build up a relationship. If you're not comfortable or have a hard time like really trusting your own abilities to perceive and talk with spirits, write a message. Like, write something to them. Leave the letter on this little bit of sacred space that you set aside in your space. Let it be a missive. And see what comes of that. I mean, for me, a lot of times they've just sort of shown up, and they don't all have ties to my like physical bloodline, but many of them have ties to me from other times.
I guess a related question might be, what are some ways that you might be able to figure out if you already have a spirit guardian?
So the most potent work to me that they do is that moment when you're like going down the road and for no reason you can discern, you just have a sudden like, I need to go this other way. And you weren't really thinking about it, and it doesn't really feel like you. It just feels like something has nudged you. Many times in my experience, that is one of your spirit allies looking out for you. Just anticipating something, like they have a little bit broader perception. Call it, if you will, a better sense of the webs of fate. We're clearer because physical body isn't there to get in the way. Physical bodies are great, but they're also really distracting. If you felt guided at times and you can't explain it, and it seems to be more than just your own perceptions, it can be hard to parse that line because we do have our own perceptions as well. If you find yourself often in the right place at the right time or avoiding being at the wrong place at the wrong time, and you're not sure how else that's working, somebody's looking out for you. You can call them spirit guides, guardian angels, like whatever. Again, to go back to the language thing, I don't think the words are important. It's the effect. It's, practically speaking, what is this doing for you?
Back to incense.
Yeah.
Is it possible to burn like store-bought ground kitchen herbs for incense?
Yeah.
And if so, would you just sprinkle them over a charcoal?
They're going to smell like ass if you do, or like really, really bad pot. What I would recommend is, in the same way that I would elevate stuff a little bit above the charcoal, smolder them rather than burn them directly. Things that time is something that I've encountered in a couple of things, like that would be useful. understand that the things that are the green things have a very green, smoky smell to them. And especially if you live somewhere where you're not allowed to be burning pot, people may assume that you're burning pot. Like all of them right across the board have a, like, you'll know the difference if you are an aficionado of pot, but if you don't, you're going to be like, what the fuck is that? My recommendation would be, if you have a charcoal, make like a little tripod out of tin foil and have it maybe about that high above it, but not like, you know, a thick bunch of like 1 or 2 layers of tin foil above the charcoal, and then like twist some little legs to kind of hold it if you have to, you know, do it yourself.
Do you have any suggestions on how to cultivate a relationship with the spirits of a particular place if you can't go to that place physically?
You can go to that place in your imagination. You can use imagination and projection to be there. You don't have to physically be there. If you have been there before, then call to mind what the place looks like, what it felt like to be there. Appeal to all of your senses. And in building your sense of the space up imaginatively, use that as a vehicle to be present in the space from wherever you are. You don't have to physically be there to be present. If it's a space you've only ever heard of, it's a little trickier, but it's not impossible. Have some images, some pictures, something that reminds you of the place, something that lets you focus on it, and again, build up a very sensory experience of what it would be like to be there, to be present there. And then in that presence, and in that projection, announce yourself and ask permission to be present, to connect to the space, and see what responds to that request. You may not get something that is clear in words, but approach that very respectfully. Always ask for permission and consent, and always thank whatever you've worked with afterwards. It helps to give offerings. Offerings don't have to be physical. In my opinion, most physical offerings are simply vehicles for the energy you're giving anyway. So cut to the chase and give a little bit of energy. Make sure that you mitigate how much, you choose how much you're giving. Don't just say, take whatever you need. Trust me, that will bite you in the ass. I've done that, so just don't. Learn from my mistake. It sucked. It's not like it killed me, but it was way more than I was really expecting to give at the time. Oh, we're getting there.
Exciting. Do you have any thoughts about blood types and understanding that might flow with bloodlines? Specifically, they're asking about Rh negative blood.
Well, I really need to do a little bit more research into that, because apparently my grandmother was. It's why she had so many miscarriages. And I only vaguely know that there's some interesting lore connected to that. And I admit that it's something that I think partly because of my complicated relationship with my grandmother, I've sort of unintentionally put off looking into. So I'm curious about it myself. I don't know what I think, but definitely there was something going on in my family. Now, the interesting thing on that side is there's definitely like psychic weird stuff that came both from my grandmother and from my grandfather. And in tracking down my biological dad, he's a Hatha yoga instructor, so he's into some weird shit too.
And a follow-up question. Are these videos an okay place to ask questions about, like, using blood for rituals, how to safely take blood from oneself?
Well, I'm not what I consider an expert on that for a number of reasons, not the least of which is most of my PTSD as a kiddo all surround blood draws. So while it's not, I'm a terrible vampire when it comes to that because it hits a really big bad trigger for me. So I'm not a good authority on how to do that because unfortunately looking into it too much is one of my rare but very profound PTSD triggers. I can point you in the direction of like other people who might be good resources. I'm not the resource to go to on that.
And of the four elements, what is the one you have the strongest connection to?
Fire. Fire, I call the fire, I call destruction, I call the end. Although right now there's a little bit too much fire.
Fire in the flesh is less fun.
Well,
And
standing over it like constantly and constantly, and it's really more like the scented steam coming out of this
The
thing.
double toil and trouble thing. I'm trying to find that conversation we had earlier today.
Which one?
On Patreon.
There were so many.
I know today was a fantastic day for just all the good conversation topics.
In between working out like the prompts for, I'm working on a memory work deck, contemplation cards. Finally got like the art and the backing for those. Of course, there's the ongoing work for the reincarnation book. Just finished up the edits for the Dictionary of Demons. Very patient editor for that.
And that's actually one of the things that we are behind on. Not that anybody else necessarily knows this. We need to poll the patrons to see which one of your books becomes an audiobook first.
Oh.
Which of the self-published ones.
Yeah.
Because we don't have control over the non-self-published ones. But I'm working on setting up my audiobook recording studio. And yeah, that's a thing that has to happen soon. Yeah, there were conversations on the Patreon Discord earlier about possession and and we did cover some of them already. Like does it make sense to call it possession if it's willing or willingly undertaken? Yeah, just all the strange and overhyped ways that TV shows tend to portray this stuff to get viewers engaged, but also then not as well educated as they could be. How does it smell?
Really interesting.
Yeah, I want to smell it.
Warm.
It is interesting.
Warm.
And sweeter, I think, than...
A different type of sweet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, it's already a really good texture.
Yeah, it's just about there. I'm like,
Fascinating. This may not be a 4.5 hour live stream after all. Maybe only 3.5
well,
hours.
the figs, I think, were the things that were like super thirsty. I don't know what it was, but like this batch, I actually broke up the addition of the wine, so it was like half a cup here, half a cup. Every time I added something new, I added more wine, well, honey made, because it had soaked everything up every time.
I do have a question for you. And I'm also gonna record it on here so we have it as a separate answer.
Okay, give me a second
sure.
too. My voice is.
I mean, you've only been talking for what, 2 hours
No
and
idea.
48 minutes now. That's how long we've been live streaming today so far. Y'all have great questions.
And very patient as I'm sitting here like wrestling with this. Where do I get my upper body strength? Stirring Kyphi.
That's an interesting question.
I think I almost strained my thumb.
So many good questions. Okay, So,
give me a second here to make sure that nothing's too stuck on the bottom. Good Lord. Urgh.
that does indeed look like it's getting tough.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're using the sturdier wooden spatula. I think
That's why I
other
have
one
to
would
use.
have broken.
No, that's why I have to use olive wood.
Mm-hmm.
And this, yeah. Okay.
All right. You ready?
As ready as I'm gonna be.
So I used to see spirits, and I'm not sure if I've closed myself off lately. I want to reconnect with any abilities that I have. How would I go about doing that?
Okay, so a lot of people early in their life could perceive spirits, and there's a sense that at some point they became closed off. Sometimes they can remember the specific time at which and the circumstances under which they've closed themselves off. And sometimes it's just sort of like this gradual closing. Occasionally it's tied to family members or religion or culture that just sort of told you you couldn't do this. You didn't have a right to it, or it was inappropriate, or it was, all in your head and therefore not real. And sometimes it's just a matter of socializing. So, you got used to not everybody seeing these things, and so you just sort of turned your attention away. How do you get back to it, though? If there was an intense experience that scared you or made you feel guilty or shamed about this that caused you to close that down, that's going to be a little bit harder because you need to resolve how you feel about that experience. You need to revisit what led you to shut it down and reject it and come to some point of peace with something about it. Like, you need to resolve the emotions entangling you with it, because otherwise you are always going to have some reservations about what you're doing, and the echo of that experience, the echo of the emotions with that experience, will come up every time you try to do it and distract you, pull you back, pull you away from your perceptions. So resolve what led you to shut it down. And in the process of resolving that, also do your best to start paying attention, keeping records of when you think you might be having experiences, giving yourself permission to be wrong, giving yourself permission to not be as good as you think you are, and also expanding your definition of what is an experience of this type. It doesn't have to be what you've seen on TV all the time, and actually in most cases it won't be. At first it will be quiet, it will be subtle, it will often be emotion and feeling, things that don't necessarily make a lot of loud sense, and it's often information that it takes you several days to unpack. Especially the earlier you are going through it, the more you get like a blip of something, and then it's over several days as you look back at it and examine it and re-examine it that you realize exactly how much you took in and how much your conscious mind just wasn't capable of really internalizing in that moment. So another part of it is becoming accustomed to and sort of like building up your ability to process this information. And that has a lot to do with confidence and building your confidence. I can't stress enough keeping records of some sort of your process, because they really help to teach you what your techniques are, what perceptions and sensations stand out to you, and how these things are communicated to you. And they also give you a hard record to go back so you can verify stuff. Also having a study buddy or two who you trust and you can share your experiences. Because there's an awful lot of stuff that we think, that's too weird, I don't know, I feel really weird about talking about that. But then if you find that somebody else experiences it the same way, it makes you feel so much more comfortable, at which point you continue to resolve your reservations and feel more freedom in exploring how this really manifests to you. And now I stir. I stir, I stir.
Much storage. So related to that question, do you have any thoughts on the influence of estrogen or female hormones on one's psychic perceptions? A person asking is 10 years post-menopause and experiences a sort of psychic dullness as she gets older.
That is a naughty question. Not naughty, but like many tangled things. So there's some weird anecdotal evidence, usually around like poltergeist phenomenon and the idea of like the poltergeist nexus, where people who are going through a hormonal change are believed to suddenly have a whole lot of stuff happen around them. And I'm not sure how much I feel that there's a distinct connection to one hormone or another. Rather, a change of life in particular, like it has an impact on how you process emotion, how you feel internally. It can have an impact on memory. It's not uncommon for a lot of people to just sort of end up with this sort of like apathy. It's like it takes the edges off of a lot of things that like you've been kind of used to, this sort of cyclic rise and fall every month of how you feel both internally, emotionally, and internally physically. And now that's taken away, and you don't realize how accustomed you've gotten to that structure. And now having the structure gone, there's a way to sort of feel a little bit rudderless and lost. And I don't know if that means it's taking away your psychic abilities. In a lot of other cultures, croning, making that change of life, was when you came into your power as a woman, when you came into your freedom as a woman. You now like had a foot in the other realm. And so if we're going off of anecdotal stuff, there's conflicting approaches of like what influence this might have. What I would say in your case is, are you also noticing that other things seem to have dulled? Are your emotions, do they seem quieter than they used to be? And keeping in mind that that change can take 10 years, 15 years, that there's a readjustment period as your body finds a new equilibrium, a new homeostasis. So it may also be that things simply manifest differently. And as your brain chemistry has changed, it's just a matter of readjusting to a new landscape. So I don't think that menopause will end your abilities, but I do think that it can change enough of your own interior landscape that it can impact how you experience them enough that you'll feel a little bit lost and confused, and you have to kind of relearn for a little while.
Are we planning to live stream the cutting and rolling of the Kyphi?
Yes, once we get to that. I'm also really thinking, I mean, this has been an astrologically fantastic month, with lots of interesting things happening, and like it's such a momentous year. So I'm thinking about starting another batch again on the day of the solar eclipse, which happens to also be the summer solstice. So it's like the 21st, there's a solar eclipse, or the 24th. It's close enough to the summer solstice that I want to do a solar eclipse Kyphi as well. That one's going to go back to the more traditional Kyphi recipe, and I think what I will keep will be partial. That one's going to be partial raisins and dates for the base, and I'm going to have a little bit of labdanum in that one, and a couple of other substitutions, but not much. Like it's going to be mostly the stuff that I made last year. Oh, what I'd really like to be able to do is to brace this kettle against my chest, but that's not going to happen because it's real hot.
That's toasty. Need to get you a breastplate. Brace it on that.
Something that's like, fireproof, little chef's thing.
So Another question for you. Do you have any advice for someone starting their own magical or witchcraft tradition?
Get a couple of good people who are your core and start small first. You want folks that you can rely on, who have a vision that they share with you, and who are willing to put in the kind of work that you're doing, and who are not beneath you, but like you're all operating on very similar footing, because you're going to be co-creating this. My biggest advice is it's really hard to do all by yourself. There's a lot of pieces. And also understanding how the interpersonal dynamic, the social dynamic of any group works. Like, that is a tough learning curve. And you want to be able to go through that with people who you trust. Think about worst case scenarios for what might happen. Like, I don't know if you've ever done game design. There's a point where you're doing your world creating, and then there's a point where you have to kind of break it. Like, if somebody came in who really was, you know, a bad faith actor, like somebody who was just here to fuck stuff up, whether by intention or not, like, what would they do? How much would they screw it up? So before you have to get to the point where you are dealing with the fact that somebody has sexually assaulted one of your members, because it will almost certainly happen, figure out what will you do in that situation. Have the conversation before it's ever an emergency. Like, think about what are your attitudes on dealing with that. What are your attitudes on someone who is clearly delusional about their beliefs, or actually lying about their beliefs and their experiences? And what do you do to both respect a person's individual take of their experiences, but also protect people who may be misled, especially when you think that this person is just talking out of their ass, because that will happen too. And get some stuff in place before you have to write rules in the middle of the emergency. As someone who had to write the rules in the middle of the emergencies. Also, understand your group will grow. The vision will grow. It should have space to change. Don't get so married to your idea of organically and naturally on its own. That should go for anybody's personal path as well, whether or not you call it a group or a tradition. Always be open to change. I think this might be...
Given how much effort it's taking to stir, I think it might be.
Well, all right.
Wow. The boil is done?
Well, I need to get this stuff out of the way. This is out of the way.
Exciting, exciting.
Okay.
Do you want to hand it that again? I can hold the pot.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah.
The good thing about it, it cools down pretty quick. Yeah, don't get your arms on that.
Reach around? Yeah, do the reach around. We're great.
Yeah. I'm going to get another one to brace it on top.
Okay. I guess we'll see if that cures differently than it does on marble.
I mean, it's the marble is for it to be cold. It's to have a surface that is cold, or more inclined to be cold. So, all right, pick it up for a second so I can just kind of.
Ruh-roh. Flaws in plans.
It's like candy making. Set it back over there for a sec. Oh, this is a fun process.
That mountain is a mountain of Kyphi. Tiny Kyphi mountain.
interesting. There's still like all the fig seeds in here. I think the bdellium finally like actually melted. Not sure. All right, I'm gonna drag it over here. I want to just try to scrape stuff out.
Do you want me to take a turn at scraping? There.
Sure.
All right. I will let you hold the thing.
I mean, I feel better if I get burned than if you get burned because I know that I won't get burned very badly.
I'm pretty tough.
I know, but I'm mostly fireproof. I mean, I've been in a gasoline fire.
I'll fight you. I'm tough. You're fireproof. We'll see who comes out on top.
I mean, you can hike way better than I can. I can't. You can reach parts of the planet I will never be able to see in person.
But I can make videos while I'm there.
Because I'm allergic to them and the trees try to kill me.
Mm-hmm. That is one of the saddest things, though.
Yeah, well.
Because you would love them so much. Like
Oh, I
that
would.
mountain
I
that
mean,
Abby and I hiked up. You
but
would love it.
between the allergies and being sun sensitive and heat sensitive, I am just not meant to be out in the world doing that.
Night hiking is real.
Caving, maybe.
I'm good with that too. Wow, there's still a lot stuck to this pot.
Yeah, if you want to just.
Yeah, no, I'll
Yeah.
I'll get as much as I can. And it is in fact a great deal cooler
Yeah.
because if it wasn't, I would have just burned myself.
Oh, yeah, it does cool down pretty quick.
It's very nice. I still wouldn't want to be grabbing these handles.
No. The handles should cool down faster than the rest of it.
They're still toasty.
Yeah.
Uncomfortably toasty. I also need your hand to...
Oh, to hold it and steady it, maybe?
Uh-huh. Help me.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
You're one of my two hopes. Your hand is one of my... Anyway.
That sounded wrong.
Not sure what you're thinking about. Wow, is this firming up fast?
Yeah.
Jeez. Ooh, we should have put the heat on beneath it.
I mean,
It's
we could
crazy.
totally do that.
I'm not sure if we'll be able to get a lot more off, but I mean, there's still... I guess that's most of it.
There's a big chunk of it.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, fine.
I just haven't gotten the side that's closest to me yet, because it's hardest to reach.
Turn it around. No? Okay. I hope nobody has any questions. This is the boring part. Not boring for us, though. It's real fun. Yeah, because it's always such a tragedy where it's like, that's
I
like a
know,
whole
there's so
package of
much-
Kyphi that's
yeah.
just stuck on there.
I don't want to wash that down the drain. We're going to get it off.
Given how expensive dragon's blood is now, holy shit.
All right. Scrape that off.
Like, I had set forth to making this before I like went to go, oh, I'll just restock my dragon's blood after this because I'm probably going to use the whole thing up. Then I'm like, it's $100 a pound? What the fuck? Who did... Just, wow.
Who did that? By our powers combined. Attack.
That's out though because it is covered in clay.
Well, and it's also very, like, strangely solidified already in here. I worry about that one breaking.
Yeah. I was just going to try
But if you're okay with possibly a sacrifice to the Kyphi gods. Yeah, this is almost completely dry.
Yeah, it will soften up if we heat it up again.
Yeah.
I'm going to try just because this is...
Sorry. See that? Yeah, it is shorter enough to really
Yeah.
get in there.
Holy balls.
I think it's working. A little. But a little bit. Might be a good idea to spread this guy out before?
It will stay molten a bit itself, like.
Except for the bits that are on the pot.
Oh, I can really smell the dragon's blood now.
Yeah, it's really nice.
All right. Okay, this will be good for frying the rest of it off of here, though.
Good.
Okay, so maybe it's the figs, but and I think actually it was the figs that made this one a little bit more something.
Super sticky.
A little bit more, I don't know, but it is coming together quicker to gel, I guess, is.
Somebody suggests using a jackhammer.
That's about where we're at, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think oil on fingers would be able to get this unless your fingers are very much suited to mine
Yeah,
killing.
it's interesting. It's less so the very first Kyphi that I made last year, to like handle it like this, it would come off on your hands. Like, I mean, you were just covered in sticky goo. And the only thing that got it off was a little bit of olive oil. All right, so instead of flour, a little bit of benzoin powder is what you put so things don't stick.
Yeah.
And then we need the Kyphi. Yeah, so
Okay.
this is still pretty much.
Hang on.
What?
It's that. The Kyphi is actually completely blocked by this pot.
Oh, sorry.
So now I think.
Yes, now we can see.
Now I do the Cold Stone Creamery Kyphi edition. Yeah, the middle of it is still as hot as the pot was. And there's a stray bit of bdellium down there.
Oh no.
I mean, it's like the whole thing though, so it's fine. I've actually got to wait for it to cool down a little bit for me to handle the middle parts.
Interesting.
The center of the Kyphi mountain. Oh, there was a question that we missed in all that.
Okay.
So in The Psychic Witch, Matt Oren talks about 3 souls. Do you have thoughts on that? In witchcraft
yeah.
specifically?
It is. So I first encountered the idea in the Victor Anderson fairy tradition, Feri. I think it's different ways of looking at the same thing. So I had a fantastic opportunity to talk to Christopher Penczak and T. Thorne Coyle, both about their ideas of spirits and the soul and whatnot. And my opinion is that we are experiencing very similar things and giving them different terms, different names. I like the idea of the 3 souls. If you find it useful, go with it. It doesn't speak to my practice quite the same way, but I think that's largely because long before I ran across that stuff, I'd kind of come up with my own way of looking at how the soul was put together. And for me, it's higher self, lower self. The fetch is a neat concept that I encountered out of that, though, like the sort of animal soul that you can send forth. Has a lot of cognates in like old stuff we were talking about at one point in one of these werewolves and berserkers and things like that, and like people who were able to send their spirits forth in the shape of animals, and the fetch was something tied to that. I'd actually first run across the idea of a fetch at Thorn Acres. There was this pagan gal. I can't remember her name for the life of me. She went to Case Western. She looked a lot like someone else I knew later on, which I think is why like the other person's name always erases her name. But things got real weird and haunted at Thorn Acres. And there was one point where she was convinced that there was a fetch that somebody had been sending forth in the woods, and I mean she was pretty intense about it and trying to like explain to me what the hell this thing was. Which the funny thing was is I probably should have heard about it because there's an Irish concept that it's got connections to. Your fetch, your doppelganger, your double spirit thing. Molten Kyphi.
Woohoo.
It's a good thing I'm fireproof. The middle of this is still pretty warm.
Oh, bring this camera over so we can look at it more closely. Also, that stuff is like very solidly in that pot.
Yeah, well, we can try warming the pot up and trying to unstick it.
That looks awesome.
So is this one going to be the little hand-rolled balls?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that worked better. Because I always get worried when we send it out that, like, if someone doesn't read the instructions and they put the whole chunk of Kyphi on a burner at once, and it gets too hot, like the whole thing could
Yeah, it's just a big
Not-
fucking mess.
not work anymore. But if it's, if it's a little ball and you just use one at a time, I would be less worried.
One of the reasons that first batch I kind of had to do it that way is it's so incredibly sticky. Like it just
It really is.
it never like it's so sticky, and it's impossible to work with. So like when you were taking it off of here and trying to get it off your fingers, and we were just like, okay, let's grab some benzoin because this is not going anywhere.
The one thing that might work.
I can already tell that this one's going to be different from that. Like
Yeah.
It looks fascinating.
so, it makes me a fan of working with figs. Turkish figs. I didn't try mission figs. There's a couple of spots I can still feel the bdellium, like there's a couple of big chunks in here, so that'll be interesting.
Cool. So what does the rest of the process for this batch look like?
It goes probably to Inspiration House to sit because it's a little bit less humid there than it is here. And then it sits for about 3 months. So I probably won't be hand rolling this until sometime in October.
Cool.
To be fair, I'm going to go periodically and poke at it and see, like, are you done? Are you done?
Poke, poke, poke.
So if it's done a little bit sooner than that, but everything, all the literature about this type of incense is it ages, and it's like wine. You make it and then you let it sit, and it gets better with time. And I will say that the very first time I made it, that truly did bore out. So that first batch has a much more intense scent to it now, full year and month later, than it did when I first made it and tried to like kind of rush the process. And yeah, your Kyphi dough is like it's like dough. It's this goop of stuff. It's probably spread out enough, I think. When sort of.
Will the Kyphi stay soft enough to roll after
Yeah.
3 months?
It should, yeah. It gets harder, but not like brittle hard. It just gets denser. And warming it up a little bit will make it will soften up with any heat at all. So if you're having trouble like pinching it off or anything, just warming it in your hand or keeping it somewhere warm, it will soften up enough to work with. Yep. Got a little bit escaping on me. That's not going anywhere.
You will smell like Kyphi forever.
Dragon's blood Kyphi.
Oh no. How
Yeah,
will I survive? How will
Yeah.
I survive? This is
Yeah,
my question.
So one of the interesting things
This is
about
mine.
this is the last thing you add, the last whatever it is the thing that you smell first, is like the dominant scent.
Interesting.
So that's why the dragon's blood went in last, and I was like, I'm gonna I'm gonna take a chance and add a little bit of
Yeah.
the benzoin. It already had benzoin in it, so, and benzoin and dragon blood both have like that sweetness to them. Benzoin just kind of matches a lot of stuff. It's this rich, sweet honey smell. Goes into a lot of amber scented incenses. Feel like I should have a stamp that goes into this. Okay.
I think we may need to.
I'm gonna try. And I'm gonna rescue this piece of bdellium. Alright, let's see how this works. And I'm also gonna add these to the pile of things that need to get cleaned. And wash my hands off because they're covered in stuff. I am curious about red wine versus mead versus like what alcohol I add into it. Probably not hard liquor, but the mead was an interesting addition. I don't think that it's the mead that made this one so much more firm. I don't know. Could you? I'm actually going to take a brief little break to go to the little boys and girls room and in between people's room.
If anybody has questions for me, I can try to answer them. I guess I'll come over here with my computer so you can see me. I might also just stick my nose in the Kyphi, because wow. This actually reminds me of, like, you know the smell walking into those New Age shops? It smells a little bit more like traditional incense to me. I think that's the dragon's blood. But definitely not identical. It's got layers. Oh, and it is still quite toasty. That's exciting. All right. Yeah, it's all quite toasty. I'm gonna turn the heat on if that's okay.
Okay, on 2.
Alrighty. Very gentle heat for our Kyphi friends. Maybe take this one out. So we brought back the marble earlier today from Inspiration House, and there were like little tiny bits of the last batch of Kyphi that were stuck on the marble that's under here, and we've taken to using razor blades to scrape all that Kyphi off because nothing else is quite sharp enough to get it all. Oh, this is so much easier.
Yeah. No, it'll warm up.
Wow.
You just want it to
Really
not like
fast.
warm up too fast.
Yeah.
Or too hot, too much.
Yeah, well, I'll get the stuff that's on the bottom first.
Just gonna put this in the medium bag.
Oh yeah. Check that out. Even more Kyphi. But also, I can see why we wouldn't want to be scraping this to this extent with the whole mass of it.
Yeah.
It is a multi-layered process. Yeah. All right. There's one for you to scrape.
Okay.
I'll move my computer back out of the way. Ooh, that's a good question, Dusty. I do love to hike. Do I have a favorite place that really lifts my soul? I have a couple of favorite places. So one of them, I love hiking in the Grand Canyon. They have these marvelous signs as you're hiking down into the canyon that says what goes down must come up, because most people are used to hiking up things, which it's much easier to come back down when you're all tired. That's not the case in the Grand Canyon. And I've been able to help a bunch of hikers who would like get all the way down to the river and then go up
and it's like a 5,000-foot climb, understand? So like they're halfway to the top and they're exhausted and they didn't bring enough food. So I always try to bring a few extra pieces of like snacks and bars so I can share with people, because it really sucks if you have to get airlifted up by helicopter. And that happens on the regular.
Really?
It does, yeah. They actually, that's one of the things in fine print on those signs, because like if you get down and it's so much hotter than it was at the top, and you're trying to climb up, but you're overheating, you don't have the right clothes, you don't have food or water. Like people,
You're kind of screwed.
yeah, like people have died on that trail.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe I didn't mention that before.
I mean, no, I think you had.
Okay. I always travel prepared.
I also trust that you have
an uncanny ability to
well,
be fine.
also you're incredibly like physically fit.
Be tough. I'm also very bad at stopping hiking.
You are that too.
So that's one of my favorite places. But the other is the area around Lake Tahoe in California, in the Sierras. There are so many good trails there. There are so many beautiful mountain lakes.
Look at this. This is almost already
it's
like
almost
ready to just roll and stuff. I'm super cool. Super stoked. Super stoked.
Very interesting, methinks. But yeah, so the area around Lake Tahoe, the Desolation Wilderness. A couple years ago, I took Michelle with me to Lake Tahoe, and while we didn't go hiking, I did get to go on a drive around the lake and show Michelle a bunch of my favorite like overlook spots. And what did you think of that, hon?
That was really cool.
Yeah. Did it feel like a special place to you, or was it more like that the place was special to me and that sort of rubbed off?
A little bit of that, honestly. Like it was very cool. I liked the feel of the place. It was harder for me to connect to. It's like definitely like this is not my sort of space.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't help that like all of the pine stuff. Like I love the scent of it, and it just makes my nose bleed.
Yeah, that was upsetting to realize that you've been having nosebleeds every day. I didn't like that part. Now I go by myself, and I send home lots of nice videos.
I mean, I've got bad enough allergies that that's just something I'm used to.
Okay. Let's see if there's other questions. Yeah, date syrup. We finally got date syrup.
Yep.
I think it's waiting and ready for the next time we need it.
Haven't tried it in my tea yet.
Oh yeah, what does my arm tattoo say? I told people they could ask me questions.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, please.
So my arm tattoo, Karen, is it is the same thing that is written on the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. So it says in the language of Mordor, translated to Elvish script, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And when I first got it, my boss at the time asked me why I decided to make my arms evil. I still don't have a good answer for that, but I don't very much like the idea that people should chop my arms off and throw them in volcanoes. I don't think that's warranted at all.
No.
They're very useful to me. Ah, yes. And now comes the fun part of all this. Oh, wow, you're doing a great job there. Wow.
This little guy is
Yeah.
uniquely suited to this work.
Seriously. That is seriously impressive. And also, I think we're getting close to the...
Yeah, I'm getting...
Yeah. The gripping work. Very gripping.
Yeah, the interesting, like I'd mentioned flashbacks while I'm making the Kyphi, like you have to, if you're doing it by the way you're supposed to, the way they used to, you are grinding these ingredients daily and adding like each new thing, and like the whole process, there were hymns and music and whatnot being played in the background. It's like, a whole bunch of stuff going on, and some of this stuff is not easy to grind. I'm sitting there grinding it going, I remember watching other people doing this, and I remember this being the job that like I made the people who annoyed me do. Like there used to be like the military thing where you got to like go peel potatoes as sort of like duty for pissing somebody off. Grinding those cyperus grass roots, those annoying little rhizomes.
I mean, I will say that as much as I feel like it would make sense to have someone else do it, I really like this particular pattern of like you doing it, but also being able to talk and teach and answer questions.
Well,
and you don't have like the full brain that you would need to run a class. But you can still like.
Well, and there's a lot of value in like doing the whole thing, like all of the labor that goes into it, like all of the process, like really understanding the work that goes into it, the preciousness of the things you're working with, how much it takes to prepare them to go into this.
Yeah, I totally
it's a neat, very kind of zen, very, I don't know, very immersive.
I mean, it's a practice.
Yeah, there's magic, and this is definitely magic that requires like labor.
Little today. Our next door neighbors have outdoor cats, and some of them just walk by outside. Squirrel cat.
And we know it's Olivia because
she still has her tail.
She still has her tail. The other one met with something that wanted to eat him at some point, but he got away.
Oh, most of them did.
Most of him did.
The tough little cookie.
I think that's as good as it's gonna get.
Yeah, unless we go after it with a razor blade, but I
I don't want to do that on the copper. I do want to.
I'll turn this off.
Yeah, sort of. Whoosh, try to. Yeah, that's working. Smoosh it.
It totally is KP duty. And when they see us skip KP, they make us bow and kiss their feet. Camp songs. We've reached camp song o'clock. Beware.
We can move this out of the way. As I grab up these little bits. Have we managed to get the first recipe like up on the website where people can see it? Okay, good.
Yeah, I've been sharing the link. But for people who haven't seen the link yet, is the full recipe for the original Kyphi is available at michellebelanger.com/incense.
And it is, you can find it
now up on the screen.
My first point of research was a book called Sacred Luxuries by Lise, Lise, Maniche, Manniche, Sacred Luxuries. She's got, it's a whole bunch of different stuff on perfumery and whatnot in ancient Egypt. And there's a whole chapter on Kyphi, and she's got she collected all of the other recipes that are out there. Being who I am, I never like to go with one book. So since she told me where those came from, I then went on a buying spree, tracking down the Ebers Papyrus, the Harris Papyrus, Plutarch, Dioscorides, and everything else I could get my hot little hands on, so I could make sure that like what she was quoting was in fact what was there. I'm still trying to find a version of Edfu 1 and 2 that is in hieroglyphics, that is clearly marked as this is the Kyphi recipe, because I would like to get a sense of a couple of the words that people are translating. And I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert on reading Egyptian, but I do have a small vocabulary. And I just kind of like, there's a couple of the words that people aren't sure what the translation is, and I really want to poke at them, particularly peker. I think that is just one whole hunk of bdellium, maybe? Nope, that's just gotten really hard. Okay. Okay, I may have, this one, it'll be curious to see how this one cures.
Yeah, it will be.
Because this is a lot harder to roll up. And it might be that the stuff on the edges is much more like reduced in its fluid state and whatnot, but it smells so good. I expected there to be
Really
a lot
does.
more of a cinnamon. So I reduced the white cedar and I added a lot more cassia, a lot more of like the warm cinnamon we're used to having on like our toasts and whatnot. And for the longest time, I was like, all I smell is cinnamon. I mean, not that that's terrible, but it just smelled like cinnamon. Um, and I wasn't going for like just straight up cinnamon everything. I'm going for warm, sweet, musky. The reason why it's protection during the dark hours, uh, the Egyptian god Set, by the time Hellenic Egypt, like the Egypt of the Ptolemies, rolls around, Set is a very different deity than what he started out as. And there seems to be a lot of politics involved in that and kind of being demonized over time. He becomes equated with the serpent Typhon, who is a Greek critter, but is the Greek equivalent and gets syncretized to Apophis or Apep. Now the weird thing about associating Set with Typhon is way back before that, Set was the one god who faced off with Apep and overcame the serpent on the nightly journey of the bark ship of Ra, the sun god, as he went through the underworld in the hours that he wasn't in the sky. So Set at that point was great of strength, and he stood heroically at the prow of the ship with his iron-tipped spear, and he would overcome all of the things that were trying to forestall and destroy the sun. And the serpent being the thing that would try to wrap everything in its coils and swallow Ra. And Set was the one who faced off with that. It's weird how Set becomes equated with the thing that he fought. I mean, it's not actually that weird. So way back then, and this is how you have a lot of spirits from those time periods, and also why demon is a sort of a weird thing. There's the best example would be there were these spirits that are usually translated as demons that were associated with the 36 decans of the zodiac, which were a key part of Egyptian astrology and astronomy. And each of them had power over various ailments. They survive as the 36, they survive as the demons that are described in the Testament of Solomon, but these predate that by quite a lot. Now, the thing about them is they were believed to cause these illnesses, like everything from migraine to tetanus, but in causing it, they also had the power to heal you from it. And so they could both hurt or heal depending on their mood, their temperament, and also how you approach them. So the idea that Set was the being who could overcome the serpent, but also was the serpent, like, isn't that big of a stretch when you think that you had these divinities? I won't quite go so far as to call them gods, because the decanal spirits are weird. But they're definitely like bigger and badder than humans, but they are ambivalent in a way that we're not accustomed to seeing in Abrahamic faiths when we're talking about gods and goddesses. We think of the Augustinian idea of divinity, where God is necessarily all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and that's like the philosophical stance of what God must be defined as. And that has influenced Western civilization pretty significantly. It's really important to understand, if you dial back before any of that, there was a very different attitude on what gods and goddesses, demons, spirits, all of it were. They were not all good. They were much more like humans. They could do good things, they could do bad things, and it really depended on the day.
Have you heard of the Temple of Set? And if so, what was your impression of them?
I have. I can say that at least in the 2000s, they didn't seem to like me very much. Interesting. I haven't read there seems to be some more stuff that has come out that is more widely available, because when I was first trying to figure out who these people were who were popping into the House Kepru forums and like giving me a ration of shit, um, I kind of poked around and they were super, super secret. So you had to join and pay a lot of money in order to see any of their teachings. So I couldn't figure out like, where did I step on their toes? I don't know. But they were really clear I'd stepped on their toes. Uh, I like certain ideas that I've seen. I particularly like the writings of Don Webb, who I believe was in charge for a while. I have had a less favorable impression of Michael Aquino, although I have not read as much of his work as I have of Don Webb's. It's just really kind of the Nazi angle with Aquino is a bit of a turnoff. And there's kind of the few bits of Aquino's writing I've read, it's really a personal style thing. It kind of comes off a bit bombastic. But, I mean, to be fair, if you read the version of the Vampire Codex that is up on Sacred Texts, I used to too. So it might just be that I'm doing that thing that we do as human beings where we like see something that reminds us of us on some level and it just kind of gets our hair up, our back up. I mean, I don't really have a judgmental opinion one way or the other.
Have you ever thought about making a hole punch to use on the Kyphi?
Absolutely hadn't thought about it, but that makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure how I'd get it back out of the hole punch though. Like if it was like a little.
It is awfully sticky.
Yeah,
I feel like we would still probably have to roll each.
Okay, what it would need is something that's about a little bit bigger than this, and donk and doop and donk and doop.
Yeah.
Just.
Well, and a way to clean it out, because I'm sure the Kyphi would stick inside it.
Yeah, especially like maybe not this batch, but the other ones for sure.
Yeah.
I kind of like there's something very like fiddly but fun to just sit there and like roll the Kyphi, at least as long as it's not so sticky that I'm just covered in Kyphi, because the first batch I couldn't have done this and not come up with most of it still stuck to my hands.
Yeah, that was incredibly sticky.
And I don't know if that's because I used all dates. I suspect the dates. Like I'm really thinking that the fruit base is a significant role in like the texture of the Kyphi. When you figure this is, I was thinking about like incense sticks and like the mix that the stuff that they're dipped in must be. Like that has to be a batter at some point, and like what that base must be and how you would work with it, how you must probably cook it up in a similar way. Although that is, I think, mostly like wood and whatnot. And the fruit base here is, it's neat, but it's not the way we're used to burning stuff. And so like once we adjust to it, it's cool. But all right, I think I'm done. I might actually want to go get food.
Yeah, I think that given all the work you've just done, that makes a whole lot of sense. Oh, awesome.
And I weirdly am in the mood for Buca de Beppo.
Wow, okay. I can take you there.
Yeah.
I shall be your chauffeur, my love.
Chauffeur, mes chauffeur.
Oh, I've got one last question,
Okay.
and I think then we'll actually have magically like answered all the questions.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the book Vampire Magic by Lady C.G.?
I am familiar with Lady C.G. I think I knew she wrote a book, and I have been enough out of the loop that I have not read it.
Okay.
But I've corresponded with her, and now I need to go poke into the book. And then I might have like been notified about it and just had it kind of. I've had a mixed relationship with the community at large over the past decade or so, partly because of just like the toxicity and the interpersonal stuff, and it's so exhausting sometimes. So like I go through cycles of kind of like poking my head up and going, hey, to people that I used to know, and going, oh God, it's still that bad. All right, bye. Bye.
Well, thank you all for sticking with us. We've had a really impressively large bunch of people for most of this, and I think most of them are just the same people who are sticking around and hanging out with us for the past 3 hours and 45 minutes.
Thank you for keeping me company. This is a long process, but look, big old hunk of Kyphi.
Giant pile of Kyphi.
All right, I'm gonna wash my hands.
All right.
All right.
Cool.
Right, before that,
All right.
bye all.
Good night.